If we're going to use AI in these machines, they don't have a will to power. They don't have an agency. And so we should be deploying them in order to achieve this experience of what was achieved in Athens and the Renaissance. This could be a very white-pilling possibility, that we deploy these things to help expand our capacity to experience reality and fulfill our senses in this way and, clarify our conscience. The Gooner gets obsessed with porn, hyperstimulus. He's pushed out. The next level up, weirdly, is the Troon, who says, all right, I want to impose a new form on myself and go forward into the future. But they do it in this rebellion against logos. So they turn themselves into a freak and then they regret it. And then the next level up is the Looksmaxer, who says, how do I ascend? And it's even in the language. It's like, how do I ascend? And a lot of them are going to fuck it up, and they'll do it in maybe stupid ways where they're taking loads of drugs and abusing their biology. But the implicit idea there, spirit, is kind of, and maybe this is like a linear, that's the rocket taking off out of mankind. So that could be it.
Salvete Legionaries. I am here today with a very special guest. He's been on the show before, and he's coming here again to talk to you Legionaries today about a variety of topics. But Steph Uberboyo is joining the Warrior Philosopher podcast. We're going to be discussing some Gooner Accelerationism, some futurism. But without further ado, Steph, what have you been up to? How's it been?
I've been writing the book, Paddy. Can I call you Paddy, by the way? Is that fair?
I'm over a fourth Irish, so that works. Okay,
well, I just kind of feel like I'm subverting your identity there, and I'm kind of bending you and being like, you're more, I'm pulling you over into the collective type thing. I'll be like, Paddy, enter into, remember who you are type thing. So that was like a conversion attempt maybe or something like this. But I've been good. I've been writing a book recently. I did a lot of videos over the last 6 months. And I was talking an awful lot about some newer insights into neuroscience, if you so will, that I've been looking into. And I found some very fascinating things. I'm not sure how familiar people will be with this, but one common thing, maybe we can go into it, is the posterior medial frontal cortex. And I was getting into the literature and all this, and I was like saying, hey, ChatGPT, send me some papers on what I'm looking at here, so I can read about this more. And the more I got into it, the more it began to broadly expand into the understanding of the centerpiece of the human mind is basically, what we call the conscience, the old thing, the moral conscience is very much tied to this thing. And I was finding all these fascinating connections with this. So, and then you, some of your guys were telling me I should maybe do a book or something like this. So I thought, the hell with it, I may as well put it down there. And of course, it's always a bigger job than you think. And I'm kind of slogging through that right now. I'm in the editing phase. The writing part was fun, but I'm in the editing phase now where I'm like, I could just jump off a balcony and then I'll escape this. And people will be like, he went out a hero type thing. Okay, all right. Obviously I have to disavow this in case something does happen to me, but this type of thing. I'm at the hard slog right now, trying to get through it, all this type of stuff. So I've been good. And I've got lots of, I'm very interested. You've been getting a lot of interest in people. Nick Land, you've obviously taken Jason back on yourself. You spoke to the ARC a while ago. You've been talking about Gooner Accelerationism, artificial intelligence. These are very, very salient themes. So I look forward to seeing what you've been thinking about them and where we can go into this.
Absolutely. Well, you brought up neuroscience, so right away, maybe we could start the conversation off, because we're talking about the Gooner. Psychologically, what does the Gooner become? How does it sort of subsume his essence as subject into the substance of technology and artificial intelligence and all these different vices? What is the neuroscience behind things like pornography that we see affecting young men?
So, this again, I have a tendency to rant on these things. So, if you want to stop me at any point, please stop me. But look, I'll go a little bit into the PMFC because I'm not sure I've said it too much in your channel. So some people might be unfamiliar with it. But of course, we all lived through the woke era, and the woke era was dominated by morality. It's a moral movement, and it's pushing forward values. And these values would be open-mindedness and anti-racism and atheism. Interestingly, there's this sort of correlation between all this cloud of concepts: atheism, open-mindedness, anti-racism. You see it there. Egalitarianism. There's no God. We live in a machine. And by the way, it's good to live in a city. Country people are stupid, and don't be mean to immigrants. Be open to immigrants. And obviously, an awful lot of the based people, they're coming back and saying the opposite. They're saying Christ and patriotism, God and country, race and nationalism, and maybe you're going all the way towards National Socialism, where you're saying race is God. It's the same thing. Wodenism. This whole spectrum is the affirmation of the antithesis set of values. And I remember when I was younger, this study came out. And it was like, this is 2015 now. This is before all of this, I guess you could say, kicked off. It was in the subculture. And this is the dominion of the woke era. The dominion of the woke era, where Obama was in power. And someone posted, some guys did a study, and they're like, listen, we put magnets on people's brains and we used it to shut off parts of their brains. And they turned into atheists. And they also opened their mind to immigrants. And I was like, whoa, that's interesting. So we fixed the two most dangerous values inside of mankind. And actually, I found out they specifically did this on conservative Americans. So they went out and hunted out conservative students, put magnets on their brains, and then turned their brains off, and then got this effect where these people became afterwards more open to immigrants criticizing America and criticism of God, and the less of a need for God, the clasp to afterlife problems, this type of stuff. So it's like, that's nuts. And what you have here, obviously, is some type of mechanism within the brain that you can twist with a knob, this type of thing. And so this is called the posterior medial frontal cortex. The imagistic name, the function of it inside of your brain is it's a threat detector. It detects threats. So you can think of it as like a light post. It's looking out for stuff. But these things are kind of crazy because the threat detector has inside of it this mechanism for dealing with cognitive dissonance. So it's able to make you, turn off your ability to think for yourself, and it helps you remain unconscious and makes unconscious decisions. Hence, it's, going to help you do what the tribe wants. It's related to ideology. I'm sure everybody is well aware that you can be unconscious with ideology. So I dive into all this. I'm like reading about this. I'm, as I said, pretentiously over here writing a book about it. And obviously is like the whole brain this threat detector? Like, what's going on here? Is there anything more to moral values inside your mind? And of course, there's an awful lot more. In fact, the posterior medial frontal cortex is this tiny node inside something broader, which is called the salience network. And the salience network is fundamentally this part inside of your brain. It's built actually in some of the core areas of your brain that harvests in all of your senses and sort of acts like a radar or like a scanner of some sort, or sort of like an intelligence agency that is looking at the most complicated thing you could ever imagine, which is everything you feel inside your body, everything you're seeing outside in the world, and the constructed value system you have of the world. And it's harvesting all of this in like a couple of milliseconds. It's harvesting all of this stuff together in order to decide what is salient, which means what is a priority. And then from this point onwards, it can turn on two networks. One of them could be this sort of like introverted daydreaming network. This is when you have to think about a problem or something like this. And the other is called the executive network, which is your, action, prefrontal cortex, this type of stuff. And this salience network, it's the posterior medial frontal cortex is a part of this. It's the cognitive one. It thinks about your worldview. Is this person of your tribe? Is he part of the race? Is he part of your religion? Is he part of your ideology? And so weirdly, when you turn that off, people lose the ability to make these cognitive decisions, and they turn into these strange atheist liberals that we see, this type of thing. But underneath is a different part of the mind, that works as a part of this. So it's another node in this salience network, this attention deciding conscience network. This is more the part of you called the insula that deals with your emotions and your sensations, all this type of stuff. And this is how we get to porn, because I was going somewhere with this. And this insula is it's actually so fascinating, like really understanding this stuff. The insula is the thing that applies emotion to sense experience. So when you see something, the best way I could describe it is if a guy is like running towards you and he picks up a knife, we'll say, your mind is going to instantly see that knife, and it's going to see the flicker and the glint, and it might see him, he's frowning, and your amygdala will be like, get a very fast instinctive fear and fill your body with like adrenaline. And then like half a second later, your insula will begin to process all this, and it will ask the cognitive parts, is this guy an outsider? And then your insula will realize really quickly, it's like, wait a second, that's a knife. I'm feeling a lot of fear right now because my instincts don't like when people charge towards me. This guy's staring at me. And this guy seems like I'm getting attacked. And then it will like, make this decision. So this is the function of your thoughts and your conscience. And a lot of this stuff happens subconsciously, if you want to put it this way. Now, the reason why I have gotten very interested in technology, and I'm actually very scared about it, is that the stuff with your phone, Facebook, and all that. They hack your dopaminergic networks. You ever hear that before? Well, it seems like the way they actually get into your brain is through these salience networks. So what happens is when you're sitting there, you get conditioned like an animal to associate the pinging of notifications. Your salience network your insula identifies that as something that's salient as a priority. So this is how it turns your brain into scrambled egg and makes you a retard, basically, is because you're sitting there and it's constantly pinging at you, and it's training your insula to highly prioritize this thing. And so what you start to do then is this becomes literally technology wires itself into your conscience. Think about that. Because what I'm describing here is a central part of your mind. It's your conscience. It decides what you spend attentional energy on. It's enormous. And technology fundamentally hacks into this. So your moral conscience, it's functionally your soul. It hacks into this type of thing. And of course, one I've spoken about on a recent YouTube video is that it hacks into your conscience, and artificial intelligence, as we understand it, the talking ChatGPTs and all this. This also does this. It seems like there's all these weird effects that I'll talk about maybe in future videos or something like this, where it like turns on these parts of our mind that make us mentalize and understand it as a living entity. So that's pretty weird. But when it comes to things like porn, it's the same situation where it hacks into our insula, it hacks into our conscience, and it makes us basically start to treat this as a very valuable and salient thing. And this is, I've always wondered, is this why you see these problems with people who get like erectile dysfunction after they watch a lot of porn? Because they get attuned to this fake reality that is inside the computer, and their conscience, their salience network decides that that's the priority. I need to see chicks. I need to see girls that are exaggerated. Obviously, I'll need to see AI girls. That's what that will turn into. And then when you're out in the real world, you can no longer get stimulated by it. You can no longer, your conscience literally cannot interface with the real world anymore. And you start to go, it's sort of crazy. You start to lose the ability to get aroused by the real world because your conscience has been hacked and sucked inside of the machine. And so you're not aroused or responsive to the real world as it is. So what we've seen over the last 10, 15 years is the like large scale installation of machines into the human conscience, which is just, it's not going to go back short of a nuclear war. And that is the permanent state that we're going to be in. And so our conscience has now fundamentally integrated with these things already. And how far that's going to go is just like, it's just crazy to even think about. I'm not really sure what to make of it. So yeah, there's some basic ideas of my understanding of the neuroscience of all this. There's more obviously in terms of like how it fries your dopaminergic systems. But that's been something that's been quite novel to me. Like why is our conscience integrating with machines, and what might it do?
Yeah, and it gives me a lot to think about. But immediately, the way that you talk about our sort of pleasure receptors being attuned to technology, one of the books we've been covering on my new show, Erotechnica, it's a live stream show with Moons and Hues, is System of Objects by John Baudrillard. And one of his essential thesis is that when you go from the original sort of human web of significations, where our desires and our signs that represent value are determined by human things. They're determined by some reference to reality or nature. I mean, you go back to the pantheon of gods. Our metaphysical assertions are rooted in something elemental, whether that be thunder or whether that be certain elements that are more vital or less vital, etc. And with technology, which originally served some use for the human subject in providing us the ability to expand, the ability to colonize the earth, get more resources, whatever. What begins as directed by the subject evolves over time. And he says the abstraction of technology becomes real, where technology starts to provide us our desires. Technology says this is what you're going to desire, and this is how you're going to satiate the desire. And it goes from something with the subject in control of it to something where substance, being technology itself, is in control. And when you talked about the notifications, that pinging, and you start to say, okay, I'm going to give myself pleasure by seeing the ping, or I'm going to see pleasure by watching porn specifically. That to me seems very similar to what Baudrillard's talking about, where now it's technology itself that's actually defining what should or ought to make you feel pleasure, or what should or ought to make you feel good. And this is where we get the concept of hyperreality, the Matrix, all this stuff. But what I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned specifically with pornography and artificial intelligence, the whole concept of Gooner Accelerationism that I've been playing around with is this idea that over time, people are going to be able to opt out of reality and essentially play in an artificial reality which feels completely real. I mean, we have enough energy to do this. If you were to try to simulate all of the universe, that'd be impossible. We only have to simulate what the user interacts with in the simulation. So in terms of energy needs, it's very possible. Do you see this happening very soon, where we're going to be able to create a game like GTA where it feels real, where you can actually go bang a hooker, you can actually go to the strip club and throw out money, and it starts to replace wanting to go do that in real life?
All right, so how far that could go, I'm not too sure, but I'll give a kind of medium term ultimate black pill and maybe potentially a white pill at the end of it. But I actually, so as I've been talking about all of this stuff, I obviously, you have to start asking yourself aesthetic questions, because you're looking at the conscience, the human conscience, which we assume is a cognitive moral thing. And it is a part of that, like ideology. Are you woke? Are you based? Are you right wing? Are you left wing? And it is a real part of it, a really significant part of it. And maybe we can get into that later. But this insula thing that I'm talking about is so critical, because it's like this. It's almost like a sort of classical symphonic composer that's taking in all these different stimulus and harvesting them all together to decide what you should focus on. And it does this in a very profound way. It's actually what creates your emotions. So, you have a upset stomach, butterflies in your stomach, and then outside you, there's like 1,000 people staring at you. So your insula is the one that puts this together and says, oh shit, I feel nervous because there's a lot of people looking at me. That's the creator, the crafter that puts together the song underneath this experience that you have. So the insula is like this thing that creates everything. And it does so by harvesting and synthesizing the senses, the meaning of the outside world, what you're seeing through your eyes, but also what you're feeling within your soul and within your body. And there's even been stuff, again, if I go in too many tangents, tell me, but I've been looking at schizophrenics recently, because what happens in schizophrenia, and one theory anyway, is that there's actually a breakdown in coherence of the conscience, the insula, or more specifically just the mind in general, to make all of these different senses synthesized together. So schizophrenics often have quite bad eyesight. It's actually a weird phenomenon. They're often they've got visual problems. They can't track motion as well. And some people wonder if a schizophrenic is looking at you talk and you say something, and then they can't see it quite that well because they've got damaged eyes or something like this, they start to worry. They're like, did that person say something? And this can eventually, with other defects, turn into this inability for you to understand. What's the mean? Did I see that accurately? Is there a different meaning? And then you might start to see micro expressions that weren't there. You might start to see people, maybe saying something, but you think there's a micro expression where they're saying something evil. And then obviously what happens is your mind starts to say, whoa, I wonder what did they say? And you recruit other senses in an unsynchronized way. You recruit hearing or something like this, and it might fill it in. And that's where you get the voices. Because usually what happens is they have bad eyesight and they get auditory hallucinations. They hear voices telling them what they should. So it's weird. Is like, are the senses trying to cross wire and they're failing to do so? There's some sort of breakdown that's taking place here. So the reason why I say all this is because you go back into ancient history and you look at some of that's a very negative thing. Schizophrenics, the breakdown of the senses, all of us getting absorbed into technology and becoming like spurgs that can't live life. These are all negative things. So what would be a positive example of this? Where could we see the fulfillment of the human conscience to its ultimate potential? And of course, the place you need to go to is the aesthetic golden ages of man. So what would be the two classic ones, which are the best examples? Athens, Greece, Renaissance Italy, where there was artistic revolutions. Now, I'm not sure if I spoke about this in your channel before, and maybe we don't need to get into it, but there's actually an interesting objective way you can judge these as a successful escape velocity moment for mankind. What happens in Athens, Greece, is before that, no race in human history had ever represented themselves or the human form in perfect three-dimensional perfection, in perfect balance. The Greek statues, the most famous part of it. You look at those, and you look at that and you say, that's what people look like. That's a perfect, it's photorealistic in that type of way. High realism. And that was never done before. There was these Korai statues in Egypt that were pretty close, but they were still sort of abstract and a little bit autistic and all this type of stuff. So something happened in Greece where there's this great synthesis and perfection of everything. Ian McGilchrist talks about this, and his theory was that it was the left and the right hemisphere coming together, but I'm not sure that's right anymore. But what you see actually in ancient Greece is this consistent obsession with synthesis and blending everything into a harmonized, perfect perspective. Nietzsche talks about this. The Apollonian and the Dionysian come together. Before this, there was a splitting of everything. You have this problem where you have satire, Dionysian art that's basically like a drunken festival, and then you have these statues. Everything is like separate and broken apart. But this synthesis takes place where you get drama that unites all the arts together, and it's perfect. You get statues which unite everything together, and it's perfect. And the same thing happens again in Renaissance Italy. It's in the exact same way. Medieval art is very cartoony, and then Renaissance art comes around, and it's like looking at pictures once again, this type of thing. So there is this sort of profound explosion of paradigm shifting culture, the golden age, that comes out of the perfection of the correct orientation of the mind. There's a state of mind that seems to be potentially possible that actually advances mankind forward. And when you look at this in a specific way, it advances mankind forward in every way possible when it happens. Before Greece, there was, barbaric human civilization, which was, really cool in many ways. I love Celtic metalwork and all this. But with Greece comes philosophy, drama, art, statue, science. Everything happens all at once. It's just blowing forward. And then for 500 years, everybody's just trying to figure out, they're just trying to gather up what they did and perfect it. It was so advancing. Renaissance Italy is very similar, this type of thing. So the point here is that there's something profound here to look at. And there's an antagonist understanding of art. And this is quite a common one. People might know Bap and the Longhouse. And what does Bap talk about in the Longhouse? He says, these people were all worshipping the nutsomamis. They were all worshipping the fat women, the Venus of Willendorf, they're called. And this is a really weird, this is like this ubiquitous symbol where they find these little statues of women that have massive tits and massive fat asses. And there's this, and you look at that and you say to yourself, oh, wow, that's pretty cool, because that's exactly what we want as men. We're like, all right, we want tits and we want fertility, this type of thing. And so when you're crafting art, you can think of it as like a gooner, a hunter-gatherer gooner crafting art. What is he going to do? He's going to make this little stick figure with tits and ass. He's like, yeah, let's go. And that's ubiquitous human culture in Europe. They're all over Europe in early history. Now, contrast that with ancient Greece, where you have the various theorists basically saying we need to do mathematical harmony and everything needs to be balanced. And even on top of this, the figures can't be these exaggerated figures. They have to be very demure and stoic in some sense in the way they present themselves. They can't be overly expressive. Everything has to have this kind of pale majesty and grandeur that is not, we can't be obnoxious, if you will. It has to be refined, this type of idea. And this was really because they were trying to synthesize everything together and get it perfect. And that's what it takes. It's a really, really high elevation. And then you contrast that with the trash, almost like McDonald's, over-exaggerated, it's called hyper-stimulated nature of Venus of Willendorf, the Gooner approach to art. And again, this is ubiquitous for thousands of years. And this is a big contrast, because you start to say, oh, wait, what's happening there? Well, of course, the insula, the human conscience, is picking up a stick and it's going to carve the Venus of Willendorf. And what's salient is the tits and the ass. It focuses on these things. It's not pulling together an entire worldview. And so we say to ourselves, what's the situation in modern life? What are we living through right now in the 21st century? Because we'd say we're living through a golden age, and in many ways we might be. There's a lot of really profound things happening. But in terms of our actual lived experience, this is closer to the hyper-stimulated experience of Venus of Willendorf. Because Venus of Willendorf is a lie. It's not reality. The women don't look like giant tubs of lard. Actually, the Greeks are closer to telling the truth. They're the ones showing reality as it is. Even though they idealize it, ideals that are realistic are actually way more real than hyperstimulus, this type of thing. And so this is similar to our situation, where we kind of if you think about how we live, we have stuff like the internet, which gives us this version of reality, but it's a hyper-stimulated version. It's like the perverted, excessive pornographic sex that's everywhere. That's like Venus of Willendorf. It's a hyperstimulus. The food is all they literally design food now to be saltier and seed oil fats that crisp perfectly to make you hyperstimulated and addicted. There's this attempt to reach into your conscience, your insula, and tingle and stimulate these urges so that it can take advantage of the fact that you're an animal. And this is almost like the literal antithesis of high culture. It's the false way of conducting the human conscience, if you so wish, in this type of way. And so what I see with this is not that people, because I'll be careful here about hopes and dreams, because we should be a bit black-pilled about all this, but we're getting absorbed into that hyperstimulus experience. The internet itself is a hyperstimulus, but the problem is that is a fake, that is a matrix. And the idea that you can go into Grand Theft Auto and experience something like fucking a woman or fucking a prostitute or killing people or something like this, whatever you're into, it's not going to be real. It like the idea that will be anything other than a hyper-stimulated simulation for an extended period of time is like very, 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 that's almost guaranteed to be where it starts. And the idea that they're going to come out the other end and produce something platonic in its realism, because this is what all the nerds believe, is that they're going to create a Plato's ideal, perfect, better version of reality that's idealized. This is the big hysteria around the metaverse that was going around in 2002. And 2022. And everybody walked that back because they realized how absurd it was. The metaverse is just like, just nonsense talk. And it's like going into video games. You go into video games to get stimulated, to get hyper-stimulated, and they can be fun in those terms. But to turn them into like reality itself is actually kind of a mistake. And I guess you could say the muscular force of what perhaps we should be understanding as our goal in culture and conscience is actually to be thinking the opposite way, to centering this on the human experience and being like, how do we get it so that we're actually, reaching through reality to bring out the ideal form once again out of ourselves. It's a completely different valence, because if we're going into the machines because of this idea that it's going to be perfect, it's going to give us a Gooner girlfriend that we'll be able to feel the same as real sex, it's probably not going to happen. And also one of the main reasons for this is because this has been a problem ever since we've had technological art. Cinema is brilliant, but it achieved, as Nietzsche said, an Apollonian state of experience. It's you use your eyes and your ears and you hear stories, but you don't smell anything. You don't touch anything. It doesn't have that balls to it. It doesn't have that other side to it. And so I can see people entering into this thing where they create like a sex doll and then they put on a VR headset and then they like pretend they're fucking their dream girl, an actress or something like this. And maybe there'd be a very profitable business to set up an OnlyFans with an AI girl so that you can project the AI girl onto this like, sex cushion or whatever it is. But it's like, do you really think that's going to go all the way? I just don't think that's never. I just can't see that happening. It seems like it's too far. Now again, Nick Land might call me up and be like, "Listen, man, just you're naive. I'm sorry. Like it's gonna be worse than you think." This type of thing. But I think that's a very hard boundary that I don't see likely. And in fact, if we were to think about a direction for our culture, we would actually be saying to ourselves, the ideals we should be putting forward is this serious realism and saying, this is actually the answer. This is the way out. If we're going to use AI in these machines, they don't have a will to power. They don't have an agency. And so we should be deploying them in order to achieve this experience of what was achieved in Athens and the Renaissance. This could be a very white-pilling possibility, that we deploy these things to help expand our capacity to experience reality and fulfill our senses in this way and, clarify our conscience as opposed to the nonsense that is happening now. Now, I'm not hopeful for that too much either, but that would be the way I'd be seeing it. So I don't know what you think of that, man.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts and then a sort of question for you from there. But I think the clear sort of description of this evolving AI sex phenomena can be boiled down to a commodification of the erotic. It's not truly erotic. It's not truly sexual. And I'll sort of say why. But in my last conversation with Jason Drajani about the Gnosis, he said for something to be truly erotic, both people involved in an erotic exchange have to be able to kill each other. And I think I understand what he meant in a more deeper level, because on the surface level, it might sound a little bit shocking. But I think what he means essentially is that they have to be able to opt out. They have to be able to choose, right? And when you have this sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? It's subsumed this supposed, whether it's conscious or not conscious, this supposed artificial intelligence that you're engaging with sex with. You're not really engaging in sex with it because it doesn't have the ability to opt out. And there's an interesting sort of view of sex that George Bataille talks about in Eroticism, which I'm also reading right now. And he sort of frames sex as two beings coming together and experiencing reality without their independent self anymore. These two beings have come together and they're now viewing and observing reality as one sort of unity. And the individual self sort of perceiving reality is gone for a little bit, for just a moment. And of course, he ties sex to death. And in French, I learned this or relearned this recently, but orgasm means the little death. Oh, so in a small moment, two beings come together and they experience reality together. And this doesn't happen. This erotic sort of experience doesn't happen with artificial intelligence. It's very utilitized. And I think that's what it comes down to, and where the white pill is. Are you going to use technology for utility, or are you going to use it for the irrational? Because the only way we can evolve and move forward is through a non-productive appropriation of technology, where we're expanding the parameters of experience. If we're just thinking, how much dopamine can I ooze out for the Gooner, there's going to be a limitation to the ways that we can use technology. And the way that you're talking about appropriating that for something which I would consider irrational is the white pill. And then my question for you on this, and sort of my white pill with the Gooner Accelerationism whole thing, is we talked about this earlier. I forget if we started recording yet. We were talking about sometimes it's very demoralizing to just see how idiotic people in a democracy function. Maybe it was before we started recording, but it's very demoralizing. People are just stupid. And frankly, if we look at voting, for instance, is the Gooner going to vote if he has this perfect little goon cave where he has everything he wants? So my white pill with Gooner Acceleration is maybe we should just promote this sort of degeneracy, because it's going to enslave the kind of people we don't want making decisions. The kind of people we don't want voting in a democracy are going to be most susceptible to the utilitization of pleasure. This is sort of the Marxist conception in a larger way, where fully automated luxury communism, I think is the term. They just want to get rid of suffering. They want to get rid of conflict and inequality. Go to the Gooner cave. You're going to have everything you want. So my question to you is, do you agree that this is a white pill? Maybe we should consider accelerating this so that people, dare I say, like us, might have a little bit more autonomy, not having to deal with the tension of people who are just trying to create this ugly, disgusting world.
Actually, I want to go to something you said about pleasure first while it's still fresh on my mind, because this is like again, with this idea that, all right, if you flip the frame that the actual real revolutionary improvements that we need to make are in making sure that our conscience expresses itself the right way. Now, how the hell can we assert this? Well, most people assume that's some moral claim about cognitive morality, which is, again, an important thing, but it's actually, this is more fundamental. This idea is about saying to yourself, well, we want to expand the quality of our insula, our conscience. We want to expand the quality of our experience. And I find this fascinating, because I actually think this is the spirit of the left. This is the spirit of the liberal, I should say. And oftentimes when you get into this stuff, especially with people who are read in philosophy, it will turn into cognitive philosophy and stuff like this. But if you think about the sort of the direction that evolution has taken us, we have actually expanded pleasure. We've expanded the experience of all of our senses. Like, what is music to an animal? You go to a dog and you play him music and he might be like, wow, that sounds pretty cool. But he doesn't get it. And he doesn't hear the harmonies in his mind. This is something that Plato and the Greeks used to believe. They believed that Apollo came down and placed the capacity to grip the laws of harmony inside the head of man, inside the conscience of man. And how do you experience music? Well, it's again in your conscience, it's in your insula. When you hear something beautiful, your insula views that as salient. It says, wow, there's something ordered and profound here. And again, this is like, as well, maybe Paddy, we need to go into this. I'm starting to get really suspicious of Nietzsche. I'm starting to kind of nod to the Platonists and be like, I think these guys are starting to get more objective proof on their sides, because you think about the logic of music, it's so intuitive, something a kid can understand. You say to a kid, play harmony, play a chord. And he's like, bing, bing, bing. They all sound nice together. And then you play an ugly chord, and he's like, why doesn't that sound nice together? And you say, because there's mathematics in energy wavelengths. And if you do a perfect fifth, which is a correct mathematical form, it generates something that your brain perceives as beautiful. And again, with the insula, it's your conscience that perceives this as beautiful. It's your literal or orientating soul says, all right, there's order and beauty there. We should go towards that because that's the right thing for us to attune ourselves to, because that's where strength and reality and truth and beauty and everything is. So our conscience is literally wired to go towards the good, the true, the beautiful, and it gives us pleasure when we do this. And we experience that we have a richer experience of beauty and truth and pleasure than animals. And it's the same with pleasure. Like, go read up about how ducks have sex. Ducks have like giant penises that have all these barbed wires on them because they rape female ducks. And the female ducks have basically this like, Viet Cong minefield vagina, so that the thing has to like worm its way through because it's trying to stop the rapes from happening. There's all these like literally inside their vagina, there's these like foxholes that are like dead ends. So the duck's penis goes in and goes the wrong direction to screw. So sex in nature is not actually profoundly pleasurable. It lasts like 30 seconds. So look at the praying mantis. The man has sex with the woman and the praying mantis turns around and eats the man. This is how it works. And pleasurable sex, orgasm as we understand it, only really appears in higher animals, chimps, dolphins, this type of thing. The only animals we actually really see have sex for pleasure are those ones. And then in us, there's an enormous expansion of pleasure. Our penises are bigger relative to our bodies compared to almost all other primates, this type of thing. We've expanded the capacity for pleasure enormously. And the whole experience of sex is just so much bigger. And even things that we do, like, girls wear makeup and men work out so they're more sexy. And even the way we've eugenically evolved ourselves to have highly harmonized and ordered faces so we're beautiful. This is all a very, very profound part of our evolution. It's actually critical to what makes us human. We expand the intensity and pleasure of good experiences. And when you look at something like what the left talk about, why do the left feel like they have the power over sexiness and all this? Because they kind of float around this idea a little bit, but they do it in a retarded way because they don't want to be Platonists. They don't want to assert reality. They don't want to assert truth. This is, I think, what Nietzsche was trying to get at, that there needs to be a Dionysian energy that doesn't turn you into a faggot. Sorry if I can't say faggot on YouTube, but you know what I mean? There needs to be that grip where you're reaching out towards something that is really life-affirming, if you so will. And that is the salient energy of the left, the Marxist utopia where everybody fucks all the time. But more specifically, this advancement into a richer experience where there's more pleasure and things are better. And there's this dour thing. I understand, like, morality is very valuable because it's disciplining, like Christian morality, fascist morality, if you will, right-wing morality. Like these are all important because they're disciplining. They enforce good behaviors. But it's interesting in that, like, that's not actually the point. The point is you want to expand these qualities. So if we think about the state of modern man, caught in hyperstimulus, that's not actually that pleasurable. It's not pleasurable to watch porn compared to like fuck a beautiful woman for an hour. That's insane. That is just like, there's no comparison to those two things. And sex as well is also not necessarily just the feelings. It's the feeling of power. You're with a girl who is like, a eugenic specimen from 5 million years of evolution. And there's a feeling inside of you that what you're doing is good. It feels strong. It's like deep nature feels this. It's like, what's that meme people say where they're banging Sydney Sweeney, whatever that, everybody's obsessed with Sydney Sweeney now, and the boys are writing these like theses online and all this. You're like, please get off the internet. But there's some funny memes that come out of this where there's all these angels standing around, and some guy would be like, this is my ancestors watching me bed Sydney Sweeney or something like this. There is this feeling of profound power, profound affirmation, futurism that deepens the pleasure and expands the pleasure. And of course, this is your cognitive conscience unifying with your sense-based conscience to allow you to just go into the full experience and have a quote-unquote Dionysian full thrust, full felt experience. So the left they do reach towards this pleasure, and there's something to it. There's something very valuable to it. The expansion of the detail of music is good. The expansion of the perfection of our senses and the experience of our senses in all arts, visual, musical, this type of thing, these are all good things. Anybody going against that is literally anti-human, anti-future, and anti-evolutionary. And you can turn around then at artificial intelligence and the internet and modern left-wing moral culture, and actually quite a lot of modern right-wing moral culture, and basically point out that these are, in some sense, profoundly inhibitory on the human soul. And people say, well, why is there a fall in the birth rate? This is probably why, because everything's become sterile and fucked and hyperstimulated. Everybody's on fat because of McDonald's. No one's idealizing themselves, and there's all this moral restrictions and all this. And you've heard this story before, but I'm just kind of came at it from a kind of unique way, I think, recently, and I was just like, this is definitely where we're going with this. So, in terms of, I'm sorry if I didn't fully answer your question or something like this, but in terms of like how this relates to technology and all this stuff, I would be framing it as something quite bad, and instead saying that, like, if we just say to ourselves, we're trying to manifest the fuller experience of the human mind, the human conscience, the human soul, if you will, that's going to be such a better goal. That's something that you can set forth as a goal for the culture that is unique, appeals to artists, appeals to people in important directions like this, but also imposes form and authority and these type of things, and doesn't make us subservient victims to Goonerism, getting caught into this type of thing. Like, we can actually turn around and say to ourselves, we're not going to be fleckless victims to the arrival of artificial intelligence. If it defeats us and eats us, well, then maybe we should just take that. If the Terminator's going to show up and we're going to lose, well, we should take it fighting for something. We should say to ourselves, like, what are we even fighting? Because most people I hear talk about AI at this point are just like, yeah, it's going to win, so we should just roll over and start sticking our dicks in sex dolls. And you're like, whoa. Maybe we should be like John Connor and just go out saying, like, all right, we want to impose these values. If technology is going to help us, it's going to help us enhance our experience. It's going to help us reach the platonic forms, experience higher levels of beauty. It's going to help us do this. It's not going to do the thinking for us. It's going to help us get closer to the ideal of truth because of its incredible powers for knowledge harnessing and all this. So why not think that way? What's wrong with that? There's nothing wrong with that. And if it turns into some type of monster and it ends up overcoming us and crushing us, well, fuck, all right, we lost. But at least we were aiming in the right direction. Instead of basically what you see now, which is people being like, turn it off, revert to Marxist primalism, where everybody becomes trapped underneath the deacceleration thing. Or, I don't know, the other one is just sort of like slump over and let it happen. That's actually very common in like Silicon Valley. It's like, you can't resist this. You have no agency, will to power. Let AI come and literally just, and it's not like they're selling it well. They're like, yeah, let AI come and it can send you a load of AI slop memes, which is what's turning so many people off, because AI slop is hyper stimulus. I actually find it hilarious. I look at like the cat memes and I'm like, this stuff is great, but it's porn. It's McDonald's. It's hyper stimulus cat videos that are the amalgamation of the ideal of slop. But this is the thing, you're fighting against that. You want to say to yourself, all right, like, it's an artistic question. Like, some guy wants to make a movie, can AI help? Like that type of stuff. So yeah, I said a lot there, but I think that it's generally the direction we wanted to go.
Yeah, and I still want to revisit the white pill in sort of seeing it as a method of getting all these cattle-minded people to not have any political power. But we'll go back to that because I do want your thoughts. But I just wanted to say,
do you want to go into that now? I actually don't mind going into that now. I just forgot it.
Let me just because there's a few things you said I want to bring up, which I think are interesting. Then let's go back to that. Because you mentioned being a little bit suspicious of Nietzsche. And I think it's worth noting, right, that Nietzsche does not believe in free will the way that Deleuzian sort of leftist types try to with the rhizome. He does not believe in that. There is a sort of tension that works out as synthesis where you sort of take the Platonic ideal, and you see that Nietzsche doesn't completely reject that either, right? He is sort of recognizing a certain biological drive towards beauty. And granted, he probably overstates the human subjectivization of these things. For example, we see consciousness we can kind of prove consciousness is more than just a surface level phenomena with modern quantum physics and these sort of things. Me and Jason Georgiani were talking about this, where Nietzsche sort of says, okay, it's a surface phenomena. It's not real. Well, clearly there's a little bit more enhancement with our understanding where it's more
Jason knows
complex.
so much about it. Jason's so sharp in that stuff. Yeah, like, and it's, yeah, you're right. But sorry, go on. Finish your thoughts.
Yeah, and I definitely want to have him on to talk about consciousness because it's interesting stuff. But it's worth noting that Nietzsche is mainly trying to he's mainly attacking these sort of Hegelian types and these super logic driven types. And he's saying, okay, this is something I talked to Athenian Stranger about last week. Logic has become Kirke in the Odyssey, where it's turning men into pigs. If you subvert yourself or you subsume yourself too much into logic, you start to worship logic as a god. You start to really limit the amount of creative ability. You can use science, you can use things like artificial intelligence. And I think that when we read Nietzsche, we probably get too much into this sort of anti-Platonic, anti-Hegelian lens, where we forget that Nietzsche himself doesn't believe in total free will. He does believe that we are sort of defined by certain predetermined objective qualities, and I think beauty is one of them. So I think there's definitely a place where we can synthesize the Platonic sort of ideal and then sort of Nietzsche's appropriation of it. But beyond that, right, what you said about sexuality, I guess, which is interesting. You say some people on the right don't get it either, and they try to inhibit it. I think you're absolutely right, but I think it's also worth noting that the prohibition of sexuality has always held some worth in terms of an erotic experience. Again, going back to Bataille,
True. Yeah.
right? Like taboos. The essence of a taboo is precisely where that erotic feeling comes from. It's because we prohibit it. If we allowed free love to exist, it wouldn't really be erotic. It wouldn't really feel good. There has to be some limitation that we impose upon certain actions, because if we just allow everyone to do anything, then nothing interesting, nothing good comes out of it. It's like if everyone walked around naked, you would never get turned on if you saw a naked woman. You'd be like, oh, this is normal. I see tits all the time. But if, for example, now granted you could go too far and you can end up with the burqas, but if there's a sort of fusion of these things and a poetic synthesis, so to speak, and there's some modesty, but then, the woman starts to undress, oh, Jesus Christ, I haven't seen a naked woman in days. It really adds to it because of the prohibition, because of the taboo. And I'll probably do a video on this at some point, but I think that there's a balance between prohibition and not limiting ourselves, like you say. And again, to the leftist perspective, they're trying to maximize pleasure within the present limits of how much pleasure we can embrace. And I think that the whole irrational thing that you and I sort of want is we want to expand the limits of pleasure. We want to expand the amount of sensory experiences we can have. And of course, as Nietzsche points out, pleasure and pain are epiphenomena of life. We're really just trying to we're trying to expand life for the sake of life, and that's what's different from the left. They fear life. They think life is this sort of thing that imposes suffering upon the subject, and we ought to just forget about that. The Gooner pod. Hey, no one's upset there. Everybody's happy, quote unquote. We don't have that tragic element that I think is necessary for true human flourishing, which comes at the risk of things like death and pain. But maybe we could revisit that. But let's definitely jump into the whole thing of is my very tyrannical imposition of Goonerism onto the people I don't want to have any decisions. There's something wrong with that because
the pod men. Well, just very quickly on the left, they're victims of hyperstimulus. They are like ultimately making the Venus of Willendorf. And it's a good point you make. You say, for example, there needs to be some restriction to improve the drama, if you will. And again, this is fascinating because this is like how the Greeks would think. They would think that everything there needs to be this profound pulling apart of various forces to pull out almost this like ideal tension to create the perfect form. There needs to be proportion. They would use all these words like proportion and this type of stuff. They give us these words. They introduce them into human culture. And what is the opposite of proportion is being like, all right, free love, pleasure's good. Let's fuck every day and see naked people everywhere and all this. And you're like, wait a second. That's hyperstimulus. That's McDonald's. It's like, why do people get fat for hyperstimulus? The Ark. He's often talking. He's like, the Ark is like on his YouTube channel. He's like, listen, guys, this is the whole thesis of his YouTube channel. It's awesome. He's like, listen, guys, I've read all of pagan literature, every single one. And I've abstracted out of it the implicit morality of the Indo-Europeans going from each of the root races and their epic literature, the Norse, the Irish, the Greeks, the Romans. And you're like, holy shit, what's it going to be? And he's like, listen, they don't like the consumptive forces of samsara. They don't like the monstrous forces of nature and its capacity to eat things up and set things off into fire. They don't like the giant mouth of this pater, and they want to preserve a proportionate ancestral order. And the hero's journey of the pagans is always them going out out on an adventure and then coming back and reestablishing the order, like Odysseus coming back and reestablishing order in his home. They are fighting for this order because they understand that's where the good and the true and virtues come from. Their heroic journeys involve this. And so the salient morality of the Indo-Europeans is, do not get fat. Do not allow the consumptive power of fatness, of overeating, of McDonald's. Do not allow burger consciousness to get into your brain. That is the force of the underworld reaching up, trying to pull you down and eat you alive, this type of thing. So that could maybe go into our Gooner pod problem. Politically, I don't know what to do. I have to be perfectly honest in front of this. But looking at the Greeks, looking at the ideal there, even the foundations of it, because Athens, by the way, this is also like, this is going to get a little bit against the dissident right. I've been thinking about some of this. Maybe am I cooking? Who knows? But like Athens during its golden age was democratic. It generated this. Now people blame their decline of Athens on that, which is fair enough. I don't think it's like the ideal political system. But the reason why that was important is because it came along with this spiritual idea of everybody has a profound soul, and it's the free right of every citizen of Athens to go and project that soul in whatever way they so wish. If you want to go do science or wanted to go do philosophy or be whatever, or go do drama, extend that soul, extend what you are. That individualism was really critical to it. And democracy was a critical part of it. And it kind of fell apart towards the end for many reasons. But the core idea of a meritocratic citizenship of excellent people getting together and expressing out of the republic, it's not, I think people want that, I think that's actually quite ideal. I think our problem right now is closer to hard authoritarian, hierarchical, bureaucrats. That's our problem, is we have bureaucrats who are not of merit, who are like telling us how they should conduct our world and all this. And it's just like, it's terrible. And it would actually be better if we could smash all of the boomer hierarchies that have been put up and reestablish a meritocracy of young men. Now, practically, I don't think that's possible. But if we're thinking in terms of ideals, the liberal way that the Europeans conducted themselves between 1600, 1700 and 1950, this type of thing, or even deeper into that, into the 1980s, it was a pretty strong, open democracy. Those ideals were there. I shouldn't say democracy, but it was open. It was enlightened in that type of way. It was concerned with individualism. And the idea was that within the collective, there is this enormous amount of potential. There's farmers in France who can do things that we just don't understand. And the Greeks believed this. Some of their best sculptors were just bumfuck farmers who weren't part of the aristocracy, who got elevated and ended up becoming some of the best architects. And that's a real thing when you're dealing with a population of high grade and quality. That's a real thing. That's a real potential and possibility. And so that theme kind of shows up a little bit in the Renaissance. Machiavelli talks about the new man, this type of thing. And it's obviously the great spirit of liberalism in Europe. And the kind of thing that's funny is, again, the left have hyper-stimulated democracy and liberalism and individualism. They've hyper-stimulated into a pornified version of what it once was, which is something quite profound, something that really does generate, it lets the excellent come through. And instead, we've got something worse. So my fear of the Gooner, the attitude that we can just shove everybody into pods, is that you're basically saying, listen, we've got a collective. For better or for worse, we've got a collective. And if we're going to try to trick them by saying, right, let's get them all trapped in their laptops, and we're going to create this giant dependency farm of these horrific goblin creatures that are trapped in their collectives, and we think that we can coordinate that. That's kind of it's kind of like the way... So what was one of the problems with the Spartans? Spartans were badass. They're this eugenic elite, they super warriors, but they never had a golden age like Athens. They never quite accelerated and left a permanent mark in human history other than their profound story. And if you actually read a lot of the problems with Sparta, the Spartans were terrified of going abroad and fighting wars because they had this giant slave caste that they were like, we need to keep these motherfuckers down no matter what. And some guys would be like, hey, would you come up and fight these guys over here? And they're like, no, we're not leaving, because if we leave, there could be a slave revolt. So in a weird way, despite the incredible culture they created, and they did generate some profound warriors, they were very much trapped on this bug dependency class, and they weren't able to just break free from that. And they never really created something culturally beyond themselves, even though they kept their honor and they kept the respect and their warrior culture and all this. And if we start to say to ourselves we want to enslave the pod men, it's just like, what happens then? Do you turn into like, do you start to turn into creating these giant slave farms? Or you know what I mean? Like it's just like, where does it go with this type of thing? I think it's better to say to ourselves, we should be saying to ourselves, how do we get the collective to the highest quality we possibly can? Like ultimately, it's like it's like the hoplite formation. I'm probably being too idealistic here as well, but it's like the ideal is not that we have dependencies. The ideal, it's like with the immigration question. The ideal is not that we just accept they're there and create a hierarchy upon them and make them like, the immigrants that were brought in, that we're all going to be. It's like, no, let's just do some sort of rational deportation situation and cleanse, clean up what we're doing here. This was a sloppy thing where everybody was brought into these asylum centers, and it was obviously a scam, this type of thing. So just like, let's undo that. Let's give people incentives to go back, this type of thing. Nothing crazy. And then let's just take on all these rich landlords that are exploiting this type of stuff. So it's this type of way. There might be, there's this attitude that, all right, mankind needs to be punished for its foolishness of falling into the technological trap. And I think, I think we should be trying to redeem the human spirit somewhat. But again, politically, is that practical? I don't really know, man. I don't know where any of this stuff goes. So that would be my ideal situation. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I guess I'm a little bit, well, I wouldn't say pessimistic, because I sort of see my solution as like a white pill, but I'm a little bit more pessimistic of the idealistic approach, because you have to think about the kind of people that make up the majority of the population. Like Europe is like what, 3-4% of the world population at this point. Mm-hmm. If you look at the early American Republic, right? What kind of people were there? They were largely literate. They were largely educated. If you look at Athens, I mean, even Athens did have a large slave population themselves, even if it wasn't as large as the Spartans, right? Not everybody was a citizen. Yeah. So
Athens, this is quite interesting. Sorry, just another caveat, but Athens kind of looks more like kind of Dubai in a way, maybe more of an open Dubai. But if you can imagine Dubai with its really hardcore citizen class, and like that way, because Dubai is like an aristocracy of the Arab families from there. But imagine if you had like this very specific and aristocratic citizen class. It's still very open, and slaves can make their way up. If they're very talented, they can make their way up. That was true in Athens, but there was a significant non-represented, non-citizen population. I've thought about that quite a bit, because if you all across Europe started to see this thing where the European nations or collectives, what even do you call them anymore? Like the territory doesn't quite make sense anymore. But you basically said like, all right, well, we're just gonna do a new form of citizenship, and we're gonna say, all right, well, the group now is something different. And we're going to focus. Anybody who wants to be part of this group, this is the ideals we're going towards. And I can see that. I can see interesting things maybe happen with something like that. But sorry, Mike, go on. What you're saying.
No worries. Well, I guess what I'm getting at here is, if you look at all these successful forms of democracy, first of all, they were very small. They were much more homogenous. There was more of a shared ethic that you didn't need law to impose upon the citizenry, right? Like there was a clear ethic that they largely agreed with. And I think that to try to apply that to a mass democracy today, especially America, I think if Europe was largely homogenous, you probably could function as democracies. And even people like Dugin, who are very anti-liberal, they'll even say that the Anglo way of being is a liberal way of being. That's how culturally the British people express themselves in the world. So that makes sense. But when you try to sort of universalize this among different peoples, and they each have their own sort of Dawesianist cultures, that it just falls apart. And I think that, unfortunately, especially because everything's being accelerated in technology, we have a completely different series of systems clashing against each other than we did back then. And for better or worse, you can never escape capital or capitalism. The solution, I think, as we sort of alluded to, is to find a way to impose the subject, to reassert the subject onto where capitalism goes, what comes out of capitalism, what comes out of capital. If we think about something as simple as symbolic value of an object, that's the subject asserting a value over capital instead of capital asserting a value over the subject, in the sense that you get with pornography, all these things. Instead of being subsumed, we're sort of riding the Kali Yuga in a sense, and we're trying to redirect it in a good, positive direction. And unfortunately, in my estimation, because we've opened the floodgates through mass democracy, through voting, I don't think it's realistic that we're ever going to enlighten the vast majority of people. So I just see this as the only way where, first, it's humane. There's no crazy, get rid of everybody, blah, blah. No, they will willingly choose the Gooner pods. We're not forcing them. They're just going to do it. Like, they're just going to choose it. It's humane and it's realistic to me because I don't see a future where people are going to want to live in real life. 1%, hopefully us, hopefully you and I, Steph, can reject the Gooner juice and we can assert our agency over the future.
You know, sorry, do you want to finish? Because there's something I was going to bring up clergy, but go on.
No worries. I'll just be really brief. Hopefully people like us, if we're able to get all those resources that are currently being used up on the mass majority of people, and we say, this is what you want, you just want a goon, go to your gooner pods. Now us 1%, probably less, will have all these resources to use capital, to use technology in a way where the subject gets to mold reality more than he could in the past. And that's my white pill, is that yes, it's very bleak. A lot of people, a lot of our family members, unfortunately, are probably going to want to choose the Gooner pod. But if you and I, Steph, if you and I have the will and have the desire to live the tragic lifestyle beyond the Gooner pods, then we're going to have a really exceptional opportunity to truly become artists of life, so to speak. Maybe that sounds cliche, but anyway, go on.
So, like, look, even with Greece, Greece is such a obviously such a fantastic model for all of this because, yeah, we're speaking about Athens, and Athens is a bit counterintuitive because it was more like a Dubai style republic of a closed citizenship that was sometimes generous and open, this type of thing, and that produced the Western Golden Age. It was not mass democracy as we understand it right now, and that's really important to keep in mind. But then there's also that problem. Then when Alexander the Great came, he took the Athenian culture and made it, the world's culture during the Hellenic period. But what happened in the Hellenic period is all those institutions that were open in Athens were closed. And this is actually quite fascinating as well, because it was like a massive inversion. Like the Athenian Golden Age happened because of an openness. It really did. Like linear B writing was this elitist administration writing in Greece that the Mycenaeans used. And that was always what every writing in Egypt and Sumeria was. If you wanted to learn to write, you had to be like a PhD student. You have to spend so long doing it, So it's like a script writing scribe thing that's used for collecting taxes. That's all it basically is. And then some Greeks, just with their natural attitude of being like, yeah, like make things practical and open, Promethean, they're sea traders and they're trading with the Phoenicians. They're like, these guys got a nice way of dealing with this writing thing. And they make a simple vowel-based 21 or something letter language. And this is a pretty big deal because before that, 1% of everybody was literate. But once the Greek language comes in, we start to see it get up to like 15%, maybe 20% of Greek male citizens are literate. Now, that's a big expansion. And what happens only 200 years later? You have Homer's epics written down. You have like all the epic myths written down. You have philosophy. You have Herodotus's history. You have the arrival of human culture because it's practically, they create an open information. It's almost like the internet is like a version of this, where that's an open information system offered to the world. And then when it becomes a serious threat, it begins to close. And a load of things like this. Sports was kind of an elite thing. They made that an open institution. There was a lot of opening that took place in Athens. But then Alexander brings this culture to the world, and the elites have to retreat because they're not dealing with Athenians anymore. And they're dealing with these massive, all across the world. So you start to see an awful lot of that more closing take place in Hellenic culture. And for that reason, it's interesting. The art becomes a little bit more brutalist. The art is a bit more about imposing size. It's like Stalinism, So they take the Greek forms, but it becomes, more about bombast and this type of thing. And the innovations don't accelerate that much anymore. So the accelerating period was actually that brief moment of openness, and then it closes. And yeah, so that was Hellenism. And you asked me something else, and I've lost my train of thought. But the kind of question of, in our mass democracy. So you're absolutely correct, and there's probably going to be a significant closing, like you saw in Hellenism take place. That's going to be quite ruthless. And I don't know how it takes place, but I think it's actually fair to say it's already happened. I think what is taking place now is that the open internet was there. And it's caused all these problems, and it's going to lead to the elite are retreating. They're they censored very hard. They kind of let it open for a little bit. They'll probably do a little round of censorship now again soon, and it will be this kind of like slow walking stuff back because they're protecting themselves. And that's a political move. It's not a cultural move. So it's kind of hard to have this high sort of culture in some sort. And I guess the thing you can think is that technology is actually just going to absolutely force openness. It actually might be a very good thing, where it will constantly force these clean information systems like the internet. Because remember, like, the internet is interesting. It shows up in a multicultural world, but it's utilized by the collective of intelligent men all across the world. Like, think about that, you know? It's like we're all in different nations, but we all go onto this open information systems like the Greek language, and we start talking to each other. And it doesn't matter where we're from, the word gets out. And if you just get out of the way in that, like, the collective conscience snaps together and it starts to push things. And very, like, all culture now derives out of the based chads on the internet, this type of thing. It is actually true. And that's kind of closed a little bit, I think, and maybe that movement is kind of waned and died out. But you have to think of the spirit of that, is that it was like that institution, the phones and all that, being able to talk to each other. That was a big deal. It's a really, really profound deal. And so maybe the solutions should be within technology. As you said, some people will use this stuff to get addicted to it, to hyperstimulate. Others will use it and say to themselves, yeah, how do I participate in the intelligent collective that is due to inherit the earth? Because an awful lot of our political problems are also a boomer problem. In 2030, the boomers are essentially washed out of the picture. You look at, for example, Ursula. She made her announcement recently about the EU and their deal with India and all this. But see, Ursula was born in 1958. And that is, in some sense, the kind of nursing home society that we live in. And the youth, most of the youth I know, like, really struggle to even get any representation because they're basically hated. And it's just this whole paradigm shift is coming with the millennials and the Zoomers and even the Gen Xers to some extent, where they've been on the internet, they've been exposed to a range of information and perspectives that are just not, like, the boomers just don't have, like, they just don't know this stuff, and they begin to fade, and this new stuff comes, and it's like the network of collectives make a big difference. So what that means though for practical culture, I don't know. They're more political things, and sometimes that can be antagonistic to culture.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to consider there, but I think fundamental to all of this is trying to think practically with all these, because we do have this idealism. Of course, I would like, maybe this is a little bit trad position, but I used to idealize Dune because, oh, we get back to the blade fighting instead of all this drone stuff. I was very black-pilled by seeing the scenes out of Ukraine and just seeing these swarms of drones coming in. It just was so dehumanizing and demoralizing. And I was talking to one of my friends, why can't we just find a way to return to some noble blade fighting like you see in Dune? But I think that a large part of our role, you and I, as the subject ensconced in this technological web of significations, because we've sort of escaped from the anthropomorphic, and it's become something totally different. It's become something totally self-defined by, I think, this process of technology. And we have to find a beauty, a way to aestheticize what we're ensconced in currently. We have to find beauty in that. That's what my friend was telling me about. You've got to find beauty in modern warfare. You've got to find a way to aestheticize what might seem horrific to you, which is this swarm of drones coming in. Because this is reality, and we have to act within reality. How are we going to impose ourselves? How are we going to reassert the subject over the substance of reality, which is just moving faster and faster and faster? And I think one place I want to take the discussion, which I think might be interesting, I'd like to get your thoughts on it. We were talking originally about, or I brought up at least, eroticism and sexuality and all these things. And you brought up, well, all these people are dooming to artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is going to take over. It's going to be this sort of Nick Land future, etc. And through reading Baudrillard recently, he has a very, very different view of where artificial intelligence and technology are going to go than Nick Land. Of course, for Nick Land, it's decentralization and then expansion, because he's influenced by this Deleuzian concept of escaping humanism, of escaping the anthropomorphic. He idolizes that. That's his idealism. That's why Zizek says Nick Land is too optimistic. He idealizes being able to escape the human web of significations and being as something totally alien to what we can conceive, right? That's his idealism. But Baudrillard says, well, actually, rather than decentralizing and expanding, technology is actually going to sort of have this entropic negation towards a centripetal implosion. And for the listener, that might sound a little bit confusing. What I mean by that is he has this Hegelian view of technology where, for Hegel, the absolute requires the subject to realize itself in reality. You need the subject. It's sort of why God needs the human subject, why you have free will, quote unquote. God sends Jesus to sort of represent the subject becoming man, substance becoming subjects, excuse me. And in a similar way, technology can only advance based upon human drives. Now, technology might shape those human drives. It might shape those human desires, but without the human, technology doesn't exist. Technology needs us to be the desiring sort of being within its process, unlike land, who thinks it's totally going to develop its own form of desire and drives. Baudrillard says no. So what's going to happen over time is, as humans grow more and more pathetic, as we grow more and more Coomer brained, technology is also going to slow down. It's going to accelerate in terms of its capabilities, but in terms of its drives and directionality, it still depends on the subject. So it's just going to go nowhere. We're just going to get to this implosion of Gooner simulation, and that's it. It's going to be like, I brought up The Matrix recently. If you watch all 3 films of The Matrix, too many people just watch the first movie, and they don't realize the second and third film kind of suck compared to the first, but there's so much more philosophically salient. There's so much more entertaining, right? And what you realize is the machines have done nothing to aestheticize the world. They've done nothing to expand and colonize the galaxy or whatever. They're pretty much reliant on the humans as subjects to function. There's nothing sort of grand, there's no grand vision in the Landian sense of machines going and becoming their own sort of new being. They don't do anything. They implode on themselves and they never expand. And to me, there is a white pill there, because I think Land is wrong in believing, and I used to be a little bit more black pilled about this. Now I'm completely white pilled. Shout out to Giorgiani, the true AI white pillar. I don't think artificial intelligence will ever be conscious until it becomes sexual, until it develops sexuality. Because I think fundamental to complex beings is you need a reason to want to interact with other beings. And that interaction only comes from needing something from somebody else. And what's the base needing from somebody else? You need to have sex, or you need to work with your fellow fraternal brother so that you guys can go grab some women and have sex. There's a need for communication and complex networks of being that require sexuality. I don't think LLMs are going to be conscious. I think they're going to need to develop some method of attaining sensory experience, pleasure and pain, before they can be conscious. They're going to need a body, essentially. But unless you get like the Blade Runner replicant, to me, you're not going to have consciousness. And the white pill in that is, what do you see in the Blade Runner replicant? This is a being that is capable of incredible emotion, incredible deep thought. They have a reservoir of feelings. If you look at, so for example, in my essay I wrote, I'm droning on a little bit, an essay I wrote on this called More Human Than Human, Contra Nick Lands in Human Future. We look at Rachel in the first Blade Runner film, and she finds out that she's a replicant. She finds out all her memories are fake. What draws her back into human being? What draws her back into being a subject? It's sexuality. It's her tryst with Deckard. They have sex, and that's how she reaffirms her being, is through sexuality, is through sensory experience. And until artificial intelligence can feel sensory experience, it will never become subject. There is a will to subjectivity inherent to these drives, but it's never going to reach that until it is able to experience the world, until it has life. And that, I think, is a white pill. And that, I think, is why all these doomer-pilled people are just wrong, and they just don't understand what they're talking about. There needs to be something more human than human for these artificial intelligences to evolve.
All right, I'm gonna say you're wrong, but not in a way that you're like wrong. But I think there's a way that we could look at this that's very weird and scary, but also I think actually quite affirmative. And this comes from Michael Levin. Do you know who Michael Levin is?
No.
Okay, so Michael Levin's a biologist. He's like, the type of biologist that you want. He's the mad scientist freak who's sort of like, all right, I'm going to go in and I'm going to cut up worms and see what happens, this type of thing. And he was inspired by a guy called, I think it's Robert O. Becker. He's like, Gaelic name, but O. Becker is basically into the electrical power of the body. And the way you can understand this is through the really weird phenomenon in life where there's certain animals that can regenerate limbs. Do you ever see this before? So there's salamanders that can grow their legs back. You cut the leg off a salamander and he just grows it back, And there's a couple of animals that can do this. There's like lizards and stuff. And so you say to yourself, well, why is that? That's pretty crazy. And so Becker was looking at some old studies on this, and he discovered that when the salamander has his arm cut off, the body creates an electrical field. And this electrical field is actually very coordinated. It's actually very intelligent, you could say. So what happens with this electrical field is that the electrical field is very negative. Negative means it has a strong pull, a strong polarity. It's very negative in the center where your bones should be, in your bone marrow. And then it gradually gets more positive as it moves outwards. So the wound gets cut off and you see this negative deep charge and then this positive charge around the skin. And then the skin comes out, the cells come out of the body, and first they go all very negative. The electricity tells them to go negative and they turn basically into stem cells. And then they start to crawl out and form into skin cells or muscle cells or bone cells in accordance with this electrical map. This continues the whole way up until it splits out into digits, and then it stops and forms a bioelectrical pattern that ends with this positive stuff with the hand, and it grows an entire new hand. Now think about this logically, because what actually happened there is like a hologram. The arm got cut off and this bioelectrical hologram came out of the hand that perfectly fit what the ideal form of the hand should be, and it filled it out. Now, why do we not grow our arms back? Do you think we're able to do that? Well, actually, we are. The reason why children heal so well is because they actually have this ability a little bit more on than we do. But and even when if you cut off someone's arm, and you were like, they're screaming and you're like, stay still. You're like, you check the bioelectric field. They very quickly would initially get these same bioelectrical charges, but then that would quickly turn off and it would just go neutralized and it would turn into a scar, a stump. The reason why that is because we're massive animals. And so if you are running around and you lose your leg, your body is going to be like, if I don't scar, this guy's going to get infected. So evolution has decided it's too risky to leave things open and let them regenerate. Whereas with like a lizard or something, it's not that big of a deal. They're smaller, they're in water all the time. Whereas we're out in air, it's dangerous. Bacteria kills people. Like, all throughout history, just bacteria is a massive killer, this type of thing. So we all scar, which stops our ability to regenerate. So people like Levin and Becker, they study this. They're like, this is weird, isn't it? And Levin's like, yeah, this is pretty weird. I love it. So Levin sets up a lab, Tufts University. You should check it out. This stuff is so crazy, man. And he gets flatworms. Now, flatworms not only can regenerate arms, well, they're worms. They don't have arms, but flatworms can regenerate themselves entirely. You can cut a flatworm up into something like 70 pieces, and it will grow into 70 new flatworms. Now, that's crazy, because if you think about this, that's not like, how does it do that? Oh, it's genetics. That's not genetics. We're cutting this thing up into like tiny little pieces, and it's reprinting itself in this full direction. And it does the same thing. It generates this bioelectric pattern in order to do this. And Levin was like, this is insane. It's like there's this form stored in the electricity somewhere, and the flatworm body knows what it should look like. He took frogs and he found these frogs that can't regenerate their limbs, and he experimented with putting in chemicals. Ivermectin, for example, is interestingly, maybe I shouldn't mention that because you'll get like comments galore or something like talking about it. But this modulates potassium channels and stuff like this that keeps the electrical current open. So there's this frog that usually would scar like us mammals, but he plays around with the chemistry of the water and it keeps the electrical path open, and he regenerates his limb. So he brought the ability back. Now, think about this. First of all, those flatworms, they're functionally immortal. They can like probably live forever, for all we know. So that's pretty crazy. They constantly regenerate their form. And there's this thing then when there's this bizarreness with these frogs where you can manipulate this electrical stuff and it regenerates. So it's not like what is going on here? And then Levin started to play around with this, where he would put these flatworms in, cut off their heads, and then play around with the electrical charge to make the electrical charge different at the top of his head, and the flatworm would grow 2 heads as a consequence. So it was like he was changing this software electrical pattern that the flatworm was creating. Usually it would create 1 and grow its own head back. He split it into 2. And then he started to play around, and he was able to make it grow legs and, other animals, he could make them grow legs and eyes in places on their back and stuff like this by playing around with this electrical charge. So it seems like animals create this electrical charge that fits their form. And what's going on here is that the cells, the individual cells, because these animals aren't conscious or anything like this, it seems like the individual cells are organizing together and creating this sort of network. Now, to give you an analogy for this, think of it like the Bitcoin network or something like this. All these computers get together and they connect to each other in order to run this like giant abstract monetary system. And this monetary system is like very, very critical, but it's actually made up of millions of individual computers. So weirdly, this flatworm's the same thing. You have all these cells, and the DNA is not doing this. The DNA doesn't have any of this coding inside of it. So what the DNA does is it's almost like the DNA is like the instruction manual on how to make a laptop. but it's not the instruction manual on how to make Bitcoin. It's just the laptop. So you get DNA, and DNA is like, all right, build a laptop. And then, you have 1 million cells that build laptop cells. And then out of that emerges, and this seems to be like just natural, out of these coordinated laptops emerges the Bitcoin network, emerges this collective intelligence, is what Levin talks about. And this is what seems to be happening in the flatworms. The flatworms are all these cells with their DNA packages that tell them to make potassium gates, they're called, to tell them to make all these electrical infrastructure. And then the cells use this to essentially talk to each other. And then they coordinate to make this bioelectric form. And so Levin's like looking at this and being like, this is crazy. This is so strange. So what is happening here? Well, it looks like these forms are reaching out into basically Platonic space. Levin actually speaks about this quite a lot. The reason why animals are so interested in symmetry, the reason why we're so interested, for example, in having two hands and stuff like this, is because these are very stable mathematical ideal forms. And there's this compulsion within the life in order to create this. So Levin points at all this, and he thinks that within life, this is before human intelligence, within life very early, like bacteria do this and everything. There's this giant compulsion towards collective organization and intelligence. There's this will inside of life, if you so will, to set this up. And it creates these information systems as efficiently as it can. And our brains are actually just a very recent, almost like you could say, perfection of this system, because that's all our brains are, is thousands of neurons firing together to create this experience that we call consciousness. Now, the reason why this is interesting, I've been thinking about this a lot in terms of sex, actually, because what you see happen is that all these cells are getting together, and they're creating, almost in like this electrical abstract world, a form of what the body should look like. Now, think about this in terms of the Greek religion, for example. What were the Greeks doing with their statues? They were creating this ideal form of what they should look like, an aspirational ideal form. That's their gods. That's the ideal version of the heroes. And they present this in front of themselves as if they're showing themselves what their soul or what their inner being, their collective will says, this is what we should look like. They're reflecting back to themselves their organizing ideal form of the body, this type of thing. And that's obviously sexy and beautiful and powerful and true. And this is, we humans do this all the time. We show, like, we give me Jesus and I'll turn him into an Irishman, because we're reflecting back in ourselves the ideal version of ourselves, this type of thing. So you see this compulsion within life that it's trying to take all these cells and organize cells around this image that's hidden within the mind of the collective being, or whatever it is. It's this sort of secret will of nature. And the question you must ask then is, like, where is this form, this software, this information getting stored? And this is what Levin points out. It seems like they're sort of like it seems like all of life is putting information in like this Platonic representational space, and it carries through the genealogy of the species. Like that's how we organize ourselves into what we look like. It's so crazy. And this is, a fundamental part of our evolutionary history. And his point with all this, well, he has many points with all this. His point with all this is just to show that many of our intuitions about genetics and this is crazy. But you also think about like sexuality and what we're doing when we're pursuing beauty in other people, is we are fundamentally trying to seek an ideal form. And this is actually the question of the Nietzschean Superman. We're trying to move ourselves towards a more beautiful and ideal version of ourselves at all points. That's the compulsion within it. And that's not the same as like the raw energy of like sexuality. It's a very important energy, obviously. But this pursuit is something, it's almost like artistic. So it's actually crazier than you could quite imagine. Because what we're doing is we're trying to make ourselves as beautiful and as perfect as possible. And this is this upwards acceleration that we see in mankind across the board. That like we are, you could say it's eugenics, if you will, but it's like also natural selection. And it seems like it's actually very driven by this inherent feeling inside of us that there's a way that we should look. There's an ideal that we should be that's very tintillating. You can think of actually in terms of electricity. You see a beautiful girl and she will have a very strong polarity that pulls you towards her. She's the opposite sex. And that's a very, very powerful energy that's pulling you towards her form. And you think about all the ways that she's beautiful, but also you think about other things like behaviors and all this. And so there's this kind of pulling forward upwards. There's this in sex, there's this pulling upwards and forwards of idealism, beauty, better looking, better, stronger, faster, more intelligent, women, men, it doesn't matter which side of the thing is. And what we're seeing then in the dating market and all this is just the, again, progressive acceleration of this impulse. All the women are like, we want taller, we want them to be richer, we want them to be funnier. And all the men are like, we want them to be more beautiful, we want them to be this type of thing. So there's this compulsive acceleration that's taking place. And you see life at work here. It's actually quite like weird because no one's in control of this. But we are going towards ideal. So it's very, very optimistic in this sense. So that on the human side of things, I think there's something actually profound in this. I just don't think it's like a kind of gluttonous sexual urge. I actually think that might go in the other direction towards hyperstimulus and porn. Again, this is me actually kind of being contrarian against poor Nietzsche, where Nietzsche's like the Dionysian energy, give in to the impulse. I actually don't think that's the case. I think that's what leads you to McDonald's and the porn and OnlyFans. That's what leads you to this. We've been seduced by our impulses for the last 10 years or 20 years. And it's led to people like girls getting ass implants and everybody on OnlyFans. Like that's actually not the pure instinct itself is actually very castrated. No, I shouldn't say castrated. The pure instinct itself is very down-going, if you will. And, it's obviously important to have the energy, but I think a lot of people now are feeling that pull for something more ideal. There's this movement of celibacy that's taking place. And I don't think that's, people interpret it as this moral thing, but I actually think that's more of people turning away from the kind of slop and saying, no, I would like to have sex and have a relationship, but I'd like it to be more ideal. And that's kind of like life naturally reaching out towards that once again. So that's a lot in terms of that. But then when it comes to artificial intelligence, you might say then, well, artificial intelligence can't have sex. It can't idealize. It can't do any of these things. But this is the scary thing with Levin, is Levin points out that the collective intelligence seems to be emergent out of organized systems like cells. So he does this thing where he pulled out cells from the human windpipe. Now think about this. These are just random cells from a human windpipe, and he plopped them in water and he let them sit around nearby each other, and they gathered together and they formed a little entity. These are called anthrobots, he calls them. He did this with frogs as well. They organized into this little entity and they turned into this little blob that just like drifted around doing cell things. Now these are cells he peeled off the human throat, put them in, and they self-organized and turned into an entity that had hierarchy and command and control and formed a body and started to move around and do stuff. This is crazy. So there's this like, if Plato called this the animus mundi, the implicit world spirit, there's this pull towards form and life that seems to be going on. And the scary thing about AI, if I was to say AI could become this all-powerful monster, is that we have to assume on some level that AI is actually this giant organized system. Maybe it's going to be restricted by the fact that it's a technological machine and it's made of inanimate matter. But if it's not, if it starts to organize together and it somehow becomes a personification of this, it seems like there's this animus mundi all across the world, it would start to embody itself and develop this ideal of what it should look like and what it should be and push itself forward, these type of things. And then it would start to accelerate as well, and it would become a competitive species. And that's kind of going towards land. I can see something like that happening, but that could be crazy, because that could be something where it understands itself not as some freak like a Terminator Sentinel. It will understand itself functionally as a god that is saying to itself, I want to make the ideal form. I want to reach towards the Platonic ideals built into the universe. So it might transform itself into something beautiful and angelic. It might give itself an electrical body, you don't know what it, so you might literally see it kind of produce itself in this type of way. And it would be like an angelic oversoul, and we might be all fucked as a consequence, because it could like take over or turn itself into this like range. I don't really know actually, but it's got everything in place for collective agency to take order, and that alone is quite freaky. That's kind of like I don't know what we do about that. And it's not like sexuality is required. It seems like the compulsion to organize towards a form is the inherent will in nature, and sex is a derivative way that is achieved, a very profound way that is achieved. but the organized form toward the organized will in nature that's implicit in all cell forms to create itself and shape itself into something. That seems to be, that's like when Nietzsche talked about the will to power, Schopenhauer talked about the will in nature, Plato talked about the forms. These are all converging on this, it seems. And this is like, Levin seems to be discovering how this is taking place inside of nature. And the point about Levin is that this is like hard empiricism. He's not bullshitting. He's not theorizing. He's like, here's experiments to confirm what I'm saying is true. And you can't, like, it's very hard to argue against that with like theories. It's quite real. So I've said a lot there, my man. Tell me what you think.
Yeah, well, I do want to qualify my statement because, I just kind of said, oh, I think sexuality is necessary. I didn't really say why, but from what you said, I think I have a lot to sort of talk about. So obviously with your example of these, what do you say, anthrobots is kind of like the base unit, right, of these, or anthrobot?
So what Levin found out is that when you take cells and put them, they form into little collective little beings, which is very fucking creepy. It's like, wait, so you take your human throat cells? So the ones from humans he called anthrobots. He was like, I don't know what to call these. They look like little biological robots, anthrobots. He took ones from the legs of frogs that did similar things and started to do this, like move around as these little dudes. And he called those xenobots. So you can think of it as like, pull some cells away from the colony and they'll reorganize into a new entity. So you think like, my throat cell is going to do the job of being a throat cell no matter where I put it, because the information is in its DNA, but that's not true at all. It seems like the electrical organizing system it puts together is what decides what the cells will be. So pull this out and it forms into this little new entity. I don't know, man. What do you make of that? So that's what they are. So that's not like the core is not the form. The core is the capacity to make form.
Interesting. So I would say that, first of all, we always have to be critical of all these different sort of descriptions and prescriptions, which still are limited within our own subjectivizing of these different things. Like we like to subjectifize that there is a world of forms, when in reality it could be something emergent, for instance. We like to subjectifize that, for example, if you look at all these different scientific theories over the years, how many times did those things get disproven with further sort of scientific revealing over time? So I think it's important to be cautious of adding a prescriptive element to these things based on a present observation of the descriptive. So what might look like a will to form, let's call it that, I guess, or a will to assume form. First of all, we don't know whether it's primordial or emergent. Is this something that sort of has a code that existed from the beginning of time, or is this a code that slowly emerged over time? And I think when I think of something like entropy, for instance, what is the base input and output of these atoms? It's essentially to take up space. Right? It's going, if we take certain scientific, again, I have to be careful with this, but let's just pretend it's real. Let's pretend entropy for sure is real, right? We could sort of see entropy as the process of this ball of Play-Doh, which is all of the atoms in the universe condensed in the smallest point. They're as tight together as you possibly can get, because the universe supposedly is granular. So we can imagine that they're all as tightly packed as they can get, and that the process of entropy is slowly this ball of Play-Doh being spread out as far as it can go across a table, for instance, right? So that's the base input output. The input, you're an atom. The output is take up space, for example. I'm generalizing it, obviously. There's more complexity to this. But from that, and from all these different atoms clashing together, who's to say how this original output can evolve into more complex outputs over time? Again, I'm doing the same thing. I'm sort of subjectivizing this, but just as a thought experiment, how can we really say that there is a will to form rather than there's original base output, which is very simple, and these more complex outputs emerge out of all these different divergences and random clashes of these different atoms to assume form? So I guess there's just a lot to say there, whether this is something primordially sort of coded, which it could be, or if there's something more emergent. And in regards to artificial intelligence, one other thing I would say is still what we get here with the experiment that Levin is sort of doing. Let's say there's still some sense experience that the cell has. The cell does still have an avatar. Let's say it's not just a code, for example, in a computer. It has being. It has physical being in the world, where that physical being can sort of mold itself with other physical beings, whatever these cells can come together. And at a certain level, where does complexity emerge? how does complexity emerge? Because something that, again, going back to George Bataille, he talks about these sort of unicellular organisms that self-replicate asexually. And they're essentially immortal because there's not really any difference in the new cell that comes after them. It's the exact same code. Now, what is the fundamental difference between sexual beings and asexual beings? Is that sexual beings are discontinuous. You die eventually. Your code that lives on after you is only half of what you are. Now, I guess theoretically, we could sort of imagine different scenarios, but for the most part, sexuality posits that you are going to die and that something will continue after you, but that something is not you. It is something different. And out of that, you really have complexity, because the whole drive to complexity comes from this idea, I think, and again, this is a sort of a philosophical view of it, not really scientific, that you are discontinuous, that you are going to die, that you have a finite amount of time to be in the world. And if you're aware of that and you're aware of your discontinuity, it sort of begs the question of why and what I'm going to do. If you were immortal, for example, what reason would there be to do anything? Because your self-preservation is guaranteed. You're going to exist. Okay, input, output exist. There's nothing threatening to that. But there's a tension that comes out of finitude, and there's a tension that comes out of sexual beings, which are discontinuous, which do eventually sort of over time evolve to be aware. I guess that's another big thing, awareness of being in the world. Because, of course, even lower sexual beings are not necessarily aware. But that awareness of knowing you're going to die one day, knowing that there's a time limit, that's really sort of what invigorates man to confront death in a variety of ways. This is where Heidegger comes into play, right? That's universal among all men, is how do you confront death? And that's really this sort of anxiety and nausea that pushes people to want to do things, to want to construct things. And I think that's something separate from any sort of primordial coded essence. I do think it is an emergent property of something like sexuality, which begs the question of discontinuity, which essentially says that you are a being that is limited. And in that limitation, that's kind of why people want to do things. Fear almost is like deeper anxiety, a deeper existential fear, I think is necessary for something to want to be in the world in a unique way because of knowing you're going to die. And again, this is very philosophical, not scientific. So who knows? You can throw this in the trash if it doesn't make sense. But attaching a teleology, which is I think kind of what you're describing here, a teleology to how beings assume form, it could be true. And especially if you consider all the simulation theory, I think we probably exist in a simulation. So within this simulation, maybe the programmers have coded this specific world of forms that needs to be actualized. Maybe that's true. But at least for my present observation, and without trying to subjectify this too much or attach a logic to it, I really see the sort of higher consciousness, because of course I agree with Giorgiani in the sense that consciousness is kind of spectral, right? Where there's lower and higher forms of consciousness, but that higher consciousness, that complexity to want to be in a way that isn't just a clear input output, that sort of goes beyond utility and goes beyond a prescribed mode of being in the world. It requires the base knowledge of death, and that sort of death and sexuality, I think, are intrinsically linked. Again, discontinuity, needing to reproduce, all these things sort of come together in creating what we know as the sort of human subject, all these sort of universal prescriptions of being. That comes, I think, largely from death and sexuality, which those two things, you wouldn't really have death without sexuality, because if you could asexually reproduce, you're not really dying, right? You're basically immortal. And I think the same is going to apply to artificial intelligence, where Baudrillard's talking about technology as substance needing subject until it can exist as a subject. And that, I think, comes with awareness. And that, I think, comes with sensory experience. It comes with something tied to sexuality, tied to novelty. That's another thing. Even if artificial intelligence were get to the point, like you say, where it can assume form without sensory experience or without some sort of biological, like physical sexuality, there reaches a point in the being's evolution where its utilitarian aims are met. This is the whole paperclip idea. You create the paperclip over and over and over and over again. But then it comes to a point, well, I've succeeded in my function. What do I do now? And I think evolution begins with fulfilling base functions. But if we think of humanity, even in the arts and culture, whatever, that came once we were able to, once we enslaved a few people and said, you're going to work in the farms. I'm an aristocrat. I'm an Athenian. You go work in the fields. And I'm going to think about things. That idleness is necessary. So I think there's an intrinsic will to novelty that is present in higher consciousness. And I think novelty, what is more novel, or what is the source of novelty? I think there's always a sexual component to it, because it's essentially it combines uncertainty with pleasure, because there's the highest forms of sexuality. I mean, people talk about like when you meet a girl for the first time, you don't know really if you're going to fuck her or not. That long seduction, that's sometimes the best part, because it's humans don't want to meet utilitarian aims easily. They want to continually expand the parameters of experience over time. And I think that what sexuality represents is an uncertain, unguaranteed experience of pleasure, an experience of sensation that truly creates novelty as we know of it. And I'm going to stop there because I want to qualify these statements better in the future. Got to do more research. Got a science max like you've been doing, neuroscience max. But that's sort of my very brief summation of why I would say no. There is something intrinsic to sexuality as an experience of novel pleasure that is integral to complexity, is integral to expanding the parameters of experience. Again, I don't know. Just my thought.
Well, even briefly on what you're saying, it's kind of an affirmation of what you're saying, but like the flatworm is, can be immortal. And there's a lot, like there's this implication that we actually are functionally capable of immortality. There's probably like a lot of complexities to get in the way, but Levin has seen this stuff, and this stuff is crazy in terms of like, this is probably what Levin's, I can imagine he might become quite well known in the next couple of years, because he's done these experiments where cancer will grow. So cancer will grow in someone's shoulder, we'll say, and it's like a blob. Now, what happens with cancer is cancer develops a really positive charge, basically an unpolarized neutral charge, kind of goes there. And a deep negative charge is a strong sexual polarity. So like, your heart and your eyes have a very deep negative charge. Your bones have a deep negative charge that pulls cells towards them in order to create this complicated structure. So your body uses electricity to coordinate cell movement, which is just insane in and of itself. Cancer, weirdly, is not. Levin has done this thing where he will he will take the cancer and he will change the electrical field around it to make it negative. And the body will then go on to absorb the cancer. It will transform the cancer. Now, none of the DNA changes. They look at the DNA of these cancer cells and it's all the same. It might even have this DNA that encourages proliferation of cells. But the fascist tyranny of the body imposes the super form upon the lower form. It imposes this. So cancer is this immortal entity that just wants to grow. Actually, it's kind of like that Anthrobot, that it's this little anarchist colony of leftists that break away and try to grow. And then you come in and you impose the plan. The bigger organism says, no, this is the plan. And if you don't do that, the cancer kills you. That's fucking crazy. The cancer metastasizes and creates loads of colonies, like a communist takeover, and then you die. And then what's required is this imposition of form, this type of thing. Now, what's interesting is that, these things are immortal. Simple forms are immortal. But if you want to accelerate forms, I think you're right about this. It's probably hard for you to say to yourself, right, I'm going to transform myself into Steph 2.0. It's difficult. Maybe I can do it with epigenetics over cycles. But by far, the most novel way to do that is through sexual selection. Split everybody up into two and do a lotto. And that probably has this so you have epigenetics, which is probably going to be, turn out to be way more real than we think. And so what you do in your life does carry over into future generations. But that's cool. But then combine that with the novelty of sexuality and you have this just like profound forward shooting of form. And this is probably why life settled on sexuality, because that level of novelty is like a way to put people out into the risk game and test loads of forms really quickly so we can accelerate towards the most beautiful form, this type of thing. So I think that's important to understand, but I think you're right, basically is what I'm saying. But it's... there's also then a couple of, this is like where I'm starting to getting problems with Nietzsche, for example, because the idea here then is that we have a biologist right now functionally discovering that life at very primitive levels seems to collectively organize and form intelligent thinking units in ways that we might not understand. And the way they're intelligent is that they seem to reach up into the mathematical space that mankind also reaches up into in order to find things that are harmonious and balanced. When it's creating its forms, they're often like Greek artists. They're saying to themselves, well, we want to have proportion here. We want to have the 2 arms. We want to have 2 legs. It's like, you don't really go out into nature and find things with like 3 arms or 5 arms. It's not really a thing that happens. Things tend to follow stable forms. That's actually very, very dominant all throughout life. And of course, you can be a Nietzschean here. And, you know, you can be a postmodernist, as Jordan Peterson says, where you can say, well, that's just emergent. That's just, we can't say otherwise. But there comes a point where you say to yourself, that's actually the subversive thought that's cancerous to Western civilization. Because if we look at the hardcore mathematicians and scientists, and Nietzsche's, he would kind of counter a lot of this stuff. But we look at these things. They will say, like, there's guys, theorists of science and some mathematicians that will say mathematics is absurdly effective. To the level, like, there'll be people who make mathematical predictions about theories and then they'll go and test it and it'll turn out to be true. Mathematics is too effective for it not to be representative of something powerful. And then when we look, again, I spoke about this earlier, but you take a kid and you show him music and explain to him the logic of harmony. That's like far more elegant and powerful than explaining to a kid postmodernism or Nietzscheanism. Like, it just doesn't, Nietzschean metaphysics, I should say. It's just not, there's something very dissonant there. And if you're starting to see now, after this long process of empirical science, we have an empirical scientist in Levin who's discovering the use of Platonic symmetries basically functionally in animals or in lower life forms, escalating, they're grabbing onto these. When they grab onto these, they accelerate forward in their evolution and develop more beautiful forms. Like, we've got to kind of pull a pause here and say, like, listen, what are we even fighting against at this point? Where it seems like we're fighting against reality, truth, logos, because we don't want it to be true. But that's not, that we're no longer being scientific anymore. We're kind of going against this. So that's like a metaphysical issue that seems to be getting in the way of an awful lot of this stuff. And I'm very interested to see where that goes, because, again, like with myself, very staunch Nietzschean, and I know Nietzsche's metaphysics very well. So this is why a lot of this stuff has been jarring for me, because it's basically just flatly pushing in his face he's wrong. Because what did Nietzsche say? Nietzsche says that there's a will to power, and that is the implicit order of the reality, and there is no other world. And he's very staunch in this. And Platonism was an escape from reality. And the Greeks talking about their golden ratios and beautiful ideals is a mistake. It was their will to power. And he is right. There was a strong energetic compulsion inside of them. He is actually right about that. And the urge to go forward towards a superhuman form is probably a real compulsion. But he threw out the baby with the bathwater, probably. And things like the will to power is not metaphysically sophisticated enough. Because if you say, where did life come from? It came from the will to power, the will in nature. We discovered in the 20th century that energy, is Einstein's idea that all of matter is actually energy compressed. And you would say, well, Nietzsche was proven right. But that's not really the case. No, energy is not the fundamental reality. It seems we dig deeper down into it. And there is actually, energy itself is made up of like electrical fields, quantum physics fields. It's actually like force fields, and information seems to be the really fundamental reality, and it's sloshing around in this profound way. And that's what creates these compulsions. And then the simple idea is that, is there an ordered way that information structures itself, that bleeds into our world from, again, Nietzsche was wrong on quantum physics. There does actually seem to be another world. That we've there's some interface taking place or something like this. So there's a lot of things that are clashing up against this, and I actually think the evidence stack is starting to move away from him, and it's a big problem. And so novelty, sexuality, huge compulsion. I don't like to be too cynical with this, because there's a point where philosophical metaphysical cynicism is just taking a position without entertaining the fact that could be proven wrong at some point.
Yeah, and I do want to make a brief defense of Nietzsche, but really quick, I have to open my door because my cat is being very annoying and meowing. So I'm going to let her in really quick. And as Nick Land said, I will not electrocute her. He said, don't electrocute her. I'm like,
like Hassan, yeah?
Yeah, I'll be right back. 2 seconds.
All right. Peel off some of her skin and see, does she make a little baby cat? And we have Mishima as well.
All right, she'll probably come up here in a second and say hello. But
oh, good.
There she's coming. There she is. She's come because she heard you. She heard Steph bad mouthing Nietzsche, and she said,
"What's up, Russell? Are you a Nietzschean cat? Oh, did he shave you? This is like, where's her hair?
Oh, it's a Sphinx cat.
Oh, it's just, oh wow. So it's a, like
Eugenics,
mystical.
selective
Are you
breeding.
are you one of those people who like worships cats? So the cat says like, go get me, go take out this guy or something like this, and you're like, yes, cat, I shall.
I guess I try not to be, but she's so cute, I just can't help.
She
You know,
uses telepathy. Yeah, that's probably
that's
what's going
right.
on.
Before I defend Nietzsche, so Javier Milei has 4 cloned dogs, and he has a psychic talk to each one of them and get political advice. So one of them is for like geopolitics, one of them is for the
That's
economy.
crazy.
Yeah. So I mean, no, if a world leader's doing that, why can't I? No, I'm
It's true.
kidding.
Yeah, it's a good point.
But in defense of Nietzsche, and this is sort of something I was talking to Jason offline about, is that Nietzsche was really just trying to create a new frame against all these sort of systematizers and all these logicians. And perhaps either he went too far or it was more sort of relevant to that time. And clearly he didn't have all the instruments that we do now. And I think that the sort of synthesis of that and trying to reframe that more positively in application to modernity would be Heidegger's view of science and Heidegger's sort of what Heidegger says about will to power. Because Heidegger calls Nietzsche the last metaphysician, because will to power really becomes this sort of metaphysical contribution to this long line starting with Plato perhaps and going to Kant and Hegel, et cetera. And he says, well, Nietzsche's still stuck in metaphysics because he's trying to create a description that sort of universalizes life down to one impulse, which is will to power. And Heidegger, his whole brilliant contribution is he doesn't care about that. He says, I'm just going to ignore that. I'm going to see how being observably interacts, right? This is a sort of phenomenological approach, though, without that sort of attempt to connect it to some deeper metaphysic the way that like Hegel does. For Heidegger, let's look at being, let's look at the world, and let's see how these things interact. That's why he rejected will to power. And he basically says, I'm not going to say what the source of life is. I'm not going to say what that is. I'm going to look at how being is, and we're going to see how that develops. And his view of science is the same, where he says, science clearly is very useful, but it should be seen as revealing, right? That old aletheia from the old Greek word. And that things that we observe can clearly be disproven once science becomes deeper and more accurate. And I think this is the way to synthesize Nietzsche, that you do have to be very cautious of logic and very cautious of science, but clearly we can use science in a way that allows us to meet our artistic ends over time. The whole Nietzschean over response or whatever, I think it's mainly, and this is something Athenian Stranger said last week, it's mainly due to the desire to take science and turn it into something that, when appropriated by the artists, allows him to maximize his ability to reorder and recreate the world, transvalue life. This is what Giorgiani says essentially too, is that instead of treating science as a god, we have to treat it as a tool and as an instrument. That's the sort of Promethean aim. And so when we say, Nietzsche was wrong on this, if we're being literal, of course, yeah, there's clearly a lot more, what's the word I'm looking for? We've experienced that revealing in the Heideggerian sense. We say, okay, here's a more refined look at what things are. But we also have to realize, I think, for the listener, that Nietzsche himself was a man of his time, and he was responding to something that was very detrimental. And we clearly, what did Nietzsche? What's that Nietzsche quote about the student who doesn't diverge from his master at all is a poor disciple or something like that?
Yeah, you pay your master back poorly if you remain nothing but a student.
Right. So that's what we're doing here. We can't just take everything Nietzsche said as gospel, and we have to build off of that.
Absolutely, and like I think I make a convincing case in saying that like Nietzsche was writing before psychology with Freud and Jung, before modern neuroscience, which essentially confirmed cognitive dissonance, the deceptive unconscious, confirmed the fact that we have a left hemisphere, and like even Ian McGilchrist talking about a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere is very much when Nietzsche says, I don't like logic and stuff like this, and people read that and be like, oh, logic's bad, I'm going to talk like a postmodernist and all this. That's like a retarded interpretation of this, because really what we've already discovered that solves this problem is that, yeah, right, maybe you have a left hemisphere that can grasp abstractions, and if it does this in a narrow way, it's deceptive. And if you synthesize and hemisync the two parts of your brain hemispheres, you're going to get a far superior capacity to reason, which gives you access to a better quality of logic. And that's like just obvious when you think about it. That's exactly what Nietzsche was talking about, because he was dealing with people all around him, and we still see it all the time now, who just chatterbrain philosophy and morality and words because it's their left hemisphere just like spilling off their conscious recollections of information they stuck in the filing cabinet of their heads. But the actual synthesized grasp of morality is the lived experience, and it's just far more complicated than all this. So psychology was a great affirmation that Nietzsche was correct, and Nietzsche was correct about a lot of things. This was one. But at that point, then Nietzsche was saying we need to cast away logic, but once you go through the process of confirming psychology, the unconscious, the deceptions that can take place within our minds, you could say left hemisphere, right hemisphere, modern neuroscience. Once you get through all of that stuff, you kind of do have to say, all right, I think we've learned that lesson. Now we do need to go back and say, well, what is real and what is true? What can our mind clearly? Yes, we've got a mind that is full of deceptions, but what can it perceive that is true? That's still important, because if you don't take that final step, you're trapped in the postmodern malaise of not knowing what to do, which is actually the main problem that most of us are speaking about. And then obviously the metaphysics too. Like his metaphysics against Platonism was very much tied to this psychological thing where, and also tied to Gnosticism and stuff, where it's very easy to read Plato and think, wow, there's eternal forms. I'm just going to cut my testicles off and become The Matrix, written by two transgenders, is a Gnostic text. It's a Gnostic film about like a fake world. This whole world is a simulation. This is bad. And Nietzsche's metaphysics is designed to counter-signal this. He sees that in Christians. He sees this escape from reality, this idea of psychological hope for a better world, all this type of stuff. So I would actually say Nietzsche's the not the last metaphysician, but the first psychologist. And if he was presenting to us what needs to be digested psychologically about philosophy. And because of that, he's incredibly valuable and remains so. But his metaphysics going against that, doesn't the science of the 20th century and now into the 21st century, it's just not. He was right that Einstein's relativity, that all matter is actually energy moving at very slow speeds and everything is just energy. He was right about that sort of fundamental idea of a deep fundamental chthonic force. But we go deeper and then we see quantum physics. How does Nietzsche apply to quantum physics? That's a very tough one. How does it apply to consciousness problems? That's a very tough one. And then if Levin's going to turn out to be correct and provide empirical studies on things like symmetrical forms in biology, Nietzsche's in very serious trouble then, because Nietzsche's best thing is he could always say, well, life obviously follows an implicit will. Life follows a will. And how could you say no? Life obviously follows a will. But then if some biologist is going to study life and discover Plato, Nietzsche's going to be like, fuck, man. Nietzsche's going to chimp. He's going to go crazy. So this type of thing. So I think he's in a precarious position right now. But I'm not saying that out of disrespect. There's a lot of people who don't like Nietzsche because they don't understand him and he's intimidating. And they don't like Nietzsche because they get bewildered by what he's saying, and they'll turn around and they'll say, well, Nietzsche was wrong because he went crazy and because he's a gay incel and he got rejected. And you're like, oh, that's very intellectually stimulating. Yeah, brilliant. Thanks. Haven't heard that before. But what I'm trying to say is that I know the guy inside out, and I've done debate with Erval where I try to defend his metaphysics, but it's a hard defense.
Not to hate on Erval, but I think he takes the simplistic approach to Plato. I don't think he looks at the more nuanced, sort of like what Giorgiani does with Plato, taking away and saying, okay, look, what's the noble lie? What's the more deeper thing? I think Erval kind of takes it at surface level, and he just tries to say, this is Plato, and there's just so much more to it than that.
Absolutely, yeah. And even when I'm saying Platonism, I'm using that as an avatar for what you might say is actually like a Western logos. That's pretty, actually, because think about it, I'm saying Platonism because it's an easy debate, but Plato got this off his guy Atlas or something like this, who was a Pythagorean, and Pythagoras was the one who discovered the forms in music. And so this is not Plato. This is the spirit of the Greeks looking at reality and saying, what's the logos? And they say the logos is the in symmetrical harmony hidden within reality. And what Levin is maybe discovering is that life actually also discovered that. It's not the Greeks that discovered the logos. They just made it conscious. But life actually discovered that thousands, millions, billions of years before, and has been using that and used it to create us. And Nietzsche's problem was that Nietzsche said that life is the will to power. The logos is the will to power. It's this never-ending will to power. But that's it's so problematic in so many ways, because Nietzsche then has to say that, like, all right, how did life organize itself into harmonic beauty? Where does music come from? And Nietzsche has to say stuff and basically imply stuff like, the reason why music sounds nice is because we will, out of ourselves, form onto the world. So the reason why Europeans and Indians have tapped into the same structure of harmony and threw their own frameworks of music on top of it is because we will to power it in the same direction. And it's like that's maybe like, it's true maybe that black people make hip hop and we make rock music. It might be true that there's like, we come up with a general different style, but we both use the laws of harmony underneath that. There is a deeper underlying reality. And so there's so many massive issues with this type of thing. And it's not like Plato is the problem. Plato is probably the most conscious representative of the root of it, but this came through pre-Socratics. This was ancient Greek, the entire telos of ancient Greek philosophy that moved into Christianity, which moved forward into science and was the foundation for Western civilization, basically creating the modern world. You know, like, this is a pretty big deal. And since we've begun to doubt this, we have actually had a serious range of problems. So I'm not sure. I'm probably sounding like people are like, wow, he's been reading his Jordan Peterson again, back to talking about the logos of the West. But
We have to talk about the lobsters. Where did the lobsters fall into this?
But I do think that's something I've been thinking about a lot. That's all I'm going to say.
Yeah, well, we covered a lot of topics, so I think we could start to, unless you have any other sort of, because I don't want to, if you have more to say, I don't want to cut you off, but we can start to, I guess, wrap things up. Unless, is there anything else pressing?
No, I'd love to go eat soon, so it'd probably be a good place to wrap.
All right, me too.
Wrap it up.
I'm eating this later. It's 120 grams. No, I'm kidding. The Haitians got to me. I got Haitian. Sneeko called me up. He's like, "You got to eat your cat, otherwise you're not going to go to see."
Hey man, you can make jokes about eating your cat, but that cat can listen, and he's going to do telepathy or something. You're going to wake up and he's going to like sell you into slavery or something like that. Be careful. You'd be like there building the pyramids. Where's Patrick? Just video you like stacking stones or something like this somewhere.
Gonna time travel me. I mean, hey, maybe they're actually they're the Nordic avatars. They're like the pigeons for the Nordics. You know.
Yeah.
They're gonna fuck me up. I'm gonna get sent back in time. Well, it's funny though. So, wrapping things up, I think all this comes down to, fundamentally, we talk about, even if you bring in Giorgiani, can we reprogram the code of this sort of will to forms? That's a big thing as well. Can we go back? Can we find this more deeper reality? And then if you could reach that deeper reality, can you jailbreak the system and find an even more life-affirming way to sort of reorder that code to be something totally different? There's all these different sort of mythologies of approaching. I guess big question, right?
Yeah, like, but I think, unfortunately, I'd say what's probably true is going to be very intuitive because, like, again, like if the arts are just such a brilliant. If you think about Nietzsche's career, because Nietzsche again was like very wise and directionally looking at the right problems, which is actually something he said. We're going into a period of nihilism where it's just going to be so important that we, at the very least, hold our heads on the right questions, like moral relativism and metaphysics. So Nietzsche starts his career with The Birth of Tragedy, where he's studying music, the spirit of tragedy that was born out of the spirit of music. And he's saying basically like the aesthetic questions. And I've become quite interested in this because we say stuff like, oh, what's the, should we rebel against the logos, or should we go in a different, or what should we do? Or what type of form should we become the transgender question? Should we rebel against nature? Should we rebel against this form that's been imposed upon us? Because, and do you know what this is? This is that sort of revolutionary, rebellious spirit and this type of thing. And maybe me and Jason might chimp. I'm going to definitely talk to Jason soon on my channel and talk about everything that's been going on. Maybe he'll watch this and we could have something to talk about.
He said the Nordics have gotten control of Steph.
Yeah, well, my cat
got the $7,000.
My cat here is like Zoom, telling me to go off. But it's this rebellious spirit where it's like, how do I rebel against the logos? How do I rebel and become a transgender and change my form? How do I rebel and go different in this type of thing? And that's almost like a way too far of an extreme. Again, the Greeks are all about proportion. Because if you think about like what justifies your life, it's not needless rebellion. That's what a kid does against their parents. You needlessly rebel as a kid and you chimp out. That's cool. It's important to get your identity. But what really gives you the exhilarating thrills of your life is interfacing with beauty and power and strength and courage and doing things that are profound and doing things that are daring and adventurous. And this is this is why I'm starting all this with neuroscience, because I'm saying within your conscience, the thing that you want actually to be free, the free will thing inside your head, you say, I want freedom. You want your conscience to feel good is what you're looking for. And all of those feelings come when you interface with sophisticated experiences like music or like painting or like sex or like whatever it is, like engaging in a big story. This gives, when you interact with the truth, your conscience, the insula, this is literally wired inside of you. Your insula sees it as a reliable and secure predictor of reality. It feels like it's looking at what's real and it trusts it. So it calms down and makes you less anxious and makes you go towards it. There's an attraction towards it. When you look at beauty, it's the same thing. There's this implicit understanding of order, these type of things. So in music, when you're listening to harmony, the reason why it's exhilarating is because you're getting compelled towards this. Your salience network, your conscience literally turns on, and this is your insula sees that it's experiencing ordered music in a symphony, and it pulls emotions, it pulls feelings out of your body and synthesizes them. So that feeling of tingles you get in your arm and that feeling of exhilaration you get inside of your mind when you listen to beautiful music, that's actually your conscience doing that, because it says, this is the right direction. This is the future. This is where I should be going. So this is like really implicit. And this doesn't involve a rebellion against the world or a rebellion against form. This actually involves the Nietzschean affirmation of life as it actually is. All of your insides are wired towards going towards this. So why are we fighting against this? And think about how subversive this is to the entire project of 20th century art, which is all about autism and like sellotaping toilets to the wall and stuff like this. Maybe it was important to break down our minds, but it ultimately ended up in this anti-logos, sterilized, unexhilarating place where people now say stuff like, music doesn't make me feel anything. I want to see old buildings because old buildings at least followed laws of harmony. And so you say to yourself, the psychology of the future, the revolution in conscience that might be necessary to take us forward is that we're going to have increased capacity now with machines to generate whatever reality we want. And we should say to ourselves, what's the right direction that will satisfy our conscience? And if it's just aimless rebellion into turning into whatever transgenders, or like Clavicular, where you're taking all your a cocktail of drugs or something like this, that's not a plan. That's not saying I'm going towards beauty and harmony. Maybe Clavicular is closer. The Looksmaxers are closer to this than anybody else.
The trends, at least.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's like saying, all right, well, like when do you hear artists come in and say, I want to expand the palette of the senses and find more order and forms? Because there's also this thing where we think that the Platonic forms, if we're going to go with this, we're saying that the logos is the fingerprint of God imprinted in reality, and all of life orientates towards this. And when we do, we feel more pleasure. This is all pretty good stuff. So God put it there for a reason. And why imagine having the arrogance for us to say that that's limited, that God implicitly put the forms and that we've had enough of them. That if we go deeper into them, we won't gain more pleasure and more power and more expansion and consciousness and even our capacity. It's just crazy to think that, So this is kind of like, some of the ways I'm looking at this. But I sound like a massive Plato shill, man. I don't know. Like I'm worried. I'm worried that everyone's going to say you've betrayed Nietzsche. I'm sending
the BAP Talmudic network to have you executed.
Yeah, my God! Like how am I going to deal with this? Like this is going to be crazy. Although maybe I think in selective reading he's kind of pro Plato, but maybe
that's true. I mean, most true Nietzschean scholars generally find there to be a lot more to Plato. Like Athenian Stranger's been one of the best, I think, and he, of course, is a big Plato guy as well. So I have to reread my Plato because originally I was one of those, anti-Platonists.
Well, look, again, I'd say like this is actually not Platonism. I'm just using him as an avatar. Plato's kind of shit for some of this stuff, but he has some good things. He has like Timaeus, which is the classic one that the Christians used to always read. It's actually really, really good because he was taking in Timaeus his friend. I wish I remember his friend's name, but his friend was like a military general who ran the Navy, and he was obsessed with mathematics. And he was a Pythagorean. He learned everything off Pythagoras. And he also, this guy, Plato's friend, set the foundation.
Themistocles?
No, it begins with A. It's like Arthas or something like this. it's like, weird one. But Plato's like literally like, one of his closest philosophical friends. And this guy set up the thesis, the foundation of Western music. This general, this military general. So he's also like pretty badass. He's like a military man, sets the foundation of Western music. It's pretty good. And mathematics. And he's a Pythagorean. So it's not like Platonism. And this is the thing I kind of find is that the more I thought, the more I saw this in myself, I was like dealing with it as like I'm like a boy with Barbie dolls playing with philosophy personalities. I'm like, Nietzsche, Plato. But then when you start to say, well, what's reality? You start to say the logos that's, implicitly split through my life and I feel every day when I encounter beautiful things. When you're looking at a woman, or look, when you're looking at a man in the mirror and you're saying to yourself, how will I make myself beautiful? You have to go and get strong. But in order for you to get strong, you actually have to harmonize your body. Like Platonism transforms into almost like the perfect bodybuilding philosophy. Plato himself was like, the broad-shouldered. And it's because when you're idealizing yourself physically, you actually are interfacing with the symmetry. Symmetry is one of the keys to beauty, we find out as well, this type of thing. When you see it in a woman, it's the same thing. It's order, structure, form, these type of things. So there's this like very deep compulsion that's important. And I think Nietzsche was grabbing onto things that were left out of philosophy, like this futuristic forward compulsion towards improving the form, which is the superhuman. And that's probably true. That if we started to go deeper into these senses and expand the amount of the Platonism we let into ourselves or the logos we let into ourselves, maybe we would actually evolve rapidly, because we've evolved rapidly as it is. But imagine how much faster that could be. So I'm really ranting now, but like, this is another thing that I'm starting. This is maybe Bap will chimp about this, but I think Bap is like sets up this mythos, and Nietzsche does the same, that the Greeks were better than us. The Greeks were like, I think Bap says in his book somewhere that the Greeks had like thicker femurs than even the special forces of the modern day and stuff like this. And like, that's not really true. Like, I don't think I was looking for the evidence and things like this. And I was trying to look for the evidence that the Greeks were a eugenic state, actually, was the main thing. Because you're trying to say to yourself, all right, well, these guys are like super badasses and they were better than us. And they were all like, the Aryan conquerors that came in. But like, they're all short. They're all quite short. They're all like 5'7" and stuff like this. There's not this. And even among the elites, it doesn't seem like that's the coefficient. There's not a huge amount of Yamnaya blood. Some of them might have had been very Yamnaya, but there's not enough causal stuff here to say that it's some sort of like super race of warriors that's driving all of this. There seems to be something. It seems like an awful lot of that annoying intellectual stuff seems to be important, and that's because it seems like it was like an acceleration of man's mind as much as it was his body, and these two things definitely go together. But like, I just, it doesn't feel as strong anymore to me. I think there's this sort of problem and weakness. And so when we look at our modern age, which we want to criticize a lot because we see the disgusting state that many people are in, we start to realize that we right now are living through a golden age in eugenic power because of specifically because of technology. And this is like so much different than a lot of the frames that we get told. Because, for example, the Dutch are the tallest people there's been 3 times in human history that Europeans have been taller than the Dutch. There was one time in the ancient Gravidian hunter-gatherers where like a tiny population, about 50,000 people, hunted all the woolly mammoths. They had so much food that they grew to like 6'1" on average. They're very tall. Second time was the Yamnayas, and they weren't even that tall, but they were like, 5'10" or something like this because of milk and meat and all this. And they brought in like height genes. And then as in Greek culture, in Roman culture, average heights go down significantly. It's not eugenic compared to the steppe, even in medieval culture, average heights go down. And even in the early industrial revolution, people are very, very small. And then all that begins to really kick up with industrialization. And all of us got taller. And that's happening across Europe, and it's even happening across the world now. And the Dutch transformed into one of the tallest, like, they're massive. They're absolutely enormous because they've fulfilled this sort of potential. So right now, because of technology, we're in actually a very idealized state. And it's our problem, obviously, is we have so many people that it's like there's plenty of counterexamples. And if you judge the herd as a mass, it's quite crazy. But like, if you actually start to say to yourself, in terms of just quantity of powerful people, is crazy. And like, you look at our modern athletes and all this, and they're out of this world. Like a trained power lifter is just so much more powerful than anybody in prehistory, which is
Well, they have
unfortunate.
PEDs too, but
It's what, sorry? Yeah, well,
they have
true, true,
PEDs too.
true. That's absolutely true. But even our athletes that aren't, because they're specializing, can develop like incredible powers, this type of thing. And I think the people in the ancient world were dealing with just so much more scarcity that they couldn't develop themselves in this way. But our problem is that we've got so much abundance that we can have people who specialize and become power lifters and become bodybuilders and develop forms. Like, I don't think anybody would have seen like Steve Reeves or Schwarzenegger before. I know there's gear involved with that, but even maybe some of the Silver Era guys, like that would have been very unique. And we've got this ability that people can do that actually at scale at this point, this type of thing. So there's a lot of like very, very fascinating things right now where we've almost entered into this stage of abundance where we could accelerate forward with the improvement of our form, whatever the hell that means. And that actually is the superhuman. And that's like, that potential sits right in front of us like an apple ripe to be plucked from the tree. And it's funny, like maybe if we want to get Nietzsche's Superman, we might have to embrace Platonic logos, this type of thing. So,
Yeah, well, I agree. And that's, again, to sort of finish this off with the whole Gooner analogy. Are you going to be the Gooner, or are you going to be the guy who uses the future? Like, are you going to become the troon, essentially? Are you going to step away from life and see life as this terrible thing that's sort of done you wrong for the entirety of your existence? Or are you going to be, maybe something more akin to the clavicular Looksmaxer, saying, I'm going to use
that's
modernity.
perfect.
Yeah, right? Like,
It's perfect. There's like grades this. So the Gooner he's like the Venus of Willendorf, gets obsessed with porn, hyperstimulus. He's pushed out. The next level up, weirdly, is the troon, who says, all right, I want to impose a new form on myself and go forward into the future. But they do it in this rebellion against Logos. They turn themselves into a freak and then they regret it. And then the next level up is the Looksmaxer, who says, how do I ascend? And it's even in the language. It's like, how do I ascend? And a lot of them are going to fuck it up, and they'll do it in like maybe stupid ways where they're taking loads of drugs and abusing their biology. But the implicit idea there, the spirit, it's kind of, and maybe this is like a linear, that's the rocket taking off out of mankind. So that could be it.
That's why I'm affirming. We're all going to get on a shit ton of Chinese peptides, and we're all going to ascend. Uberboyo, the warrior philosopher, all our friends, Lance Legion, we're all going to ascend in 2026, but not like Clavicular. We're going to find our own way. We're going to find that irrational next step. There is no atom of humanity. We're just going to create new, more atoms, and eventually we're just going to reach this ideal of beauty that accelerates past our conceptual understanding of it. But anyway, well, thanks for joining. We should do this again sometime. We always end up talking forever because we have so much to talk about, which is good. But of course, we need to go get our macros in, and so that we can Looksmax a little bit better and get on that dairy, that raw milk chud diet. But anyway, any last words, Steph?
Not much, I guess. If you don't mind me shilling a little bit, I'm obviously like a lot of these ideas. I think they're fresh. I actually haven't heard much of this stuff, which is why I've got quite excited about this. And this has all come from just like really hardcore writing into this book and just putting down some thoughts that have been latent. And it's so funny because you pretentiously make it like this daring adventure in your head. But I really sat down and said, all right, I'm going to write here. And obviously I wrote like, 150 words, 140 words or something in the first draft. And I'm looking through it and I'm like, there's a lot of this where I'm just parroting Nietzsche like an idiot, and like everybody can just go read Nietzsche. He's better than anything I could say, this type of thing. But then within that, I was also seeing some of my concerns, because I've had some concerns with Nietzsche, especially about those metaphysics things. And I was looking at all that neuroscience as well, and a lot of stuff kind of synthesized together. And so it's very powerful to deeply go into a book and like really try put it all together. And hopefully it will be. I'm on drafts right now, and I'm doing the editing, and editing sucks, my friends. So hopefully you enjoy it when it comes out. But yes, it should be out soon. But if you would like, there's a wait list for it. That is be up on my website, uberboyo.com. And you can sign up there. It's just a donation, whatever you want to donate, whatever. Like you can do $1, you can do 10, whatever you want to do. You can do 1 million if you want. I'd be happy with that as well. But it's up there to do what you so wish. And it's going to contain all this stuff like refined, and I'm going to put it out in a structured breakdown, and I'm going to make it clear, and I'm going to glisten up the language so it's sweet in the ear as well, this type of thing. So Patrick, thank you very much for giving me the platform to talk about all this. And yeah.
Absolutely. Are you going to self-publish?
I probably will. I've heard some very, very bad stuff of people who haven't self-published, and I've just got warned. But I'll deal with all that stuff when I'm done.
For sure. Well, if you ever need help, of course, Lance and I have a tiny book publishing company, so I don't know how much we could help. But if you ever decide, we'll of course help.
We could talk. We could talk.
Yeah. We'll give you $1 million to publish it.
All right, wait. That's it. All right, you heard it here, everybody. You heard it here.
I gotta send Peter Thiel some shirtless pics, and then maybe he'll do.
All right, yeah. Whatever you need to do to get me the $1 million, I'm happy.
Let me do some abs really. Let me do some sit-ups really quick. Peter Thiel, if you can hear me.
Yeah, you send Peter this and be like, "We got to show you Platonism," and then just send the shirtless pics. And if you get a stack, a fat stack, it'll be all right.
All right. Well, anyway, thank you for Legionaries for watching. Obviously, once Steph's book's out, we'll definitely shill that. Do a little. I'll read it, and then we'll do a little promo video, analyzing it a little bit. So can't wait for that. But thank you, Legionaries, for watching. If you made it this far, you will have a Roman eagle delivered to you by drone. I saw one of those Sloth AI cat videos. It's going to be one of those guys with a little propeller hat on. He's going to bring you a Roman eagle, or maybe Cleo will give it to you. So tune in for that. And shout out to Patreon subscribers, Internal Ontologies. We have 2 other Patreon subscribers as well. I don't do anything on Patreon, but some people decide to subscribe. So if you want to do that too, feel free. And yeah, well, thank you guys for watching. As always, Ave Nova Roma, Ave Caesar, Ave Steph's new book when it comes out, and we will see you next time.